Hey guys, good morning. I know it looks like I've just gotten out of prison or something. I've had a pretty busy weekend doing live programs, and I got interviewed by a guy at 2 o'clock in the morning Australian time, and that went till about 4 in the morning. So that was on Saturday morning. So that sort of threw everything into a loop. But I thought I want to just keep punching through these videos because we've still got 3 more to go, and one's going to drop tomorrow. And so I thought, well, I want to just keep on top of these. And so if you don't mind me looking like I've just gotten out of jail or something like that, I just thought I'd jump on and do this video. Now, I thought long and hard about doing a whole section on Erasmus and the comma. But what I thought I'd do, rather than stopping and going through that whole issue, because it is quite a large issue, even just to explain it would take a long time, let alone give my opinions and things like that. So what I thought I'd do is I'll leave that till the end, and I'll add it to my list of comma videos. So that will be my next video in my comma series. So sorry about my croaky throat and all that. You'll just have to endure through my difficulties here. Anyway, as I keep talking and keep going along, it should get better. So let's just jump straight into the video, because we don't want this to be long-winded for no reason. So I sort of went through a little bit of this with Timothy Berg in the last video. So what we'll do is I just rewound it a little bit just so we can get the context, and then they jump into the King James translators.
He lists 9 major readings that he sees Erasmus as having brought in from the Latin Vulgate. And the funny thing is, they're some of the biggest ones still defended by TR defenders today. 1 John 5:7, Acts 8:37, big chunks like Acts 9:5-6. And people that are defending those as though they've always been part of this stream are just ignoring that historically they didn't come into the Greek text until 1516. I've literally...
So this is the thing. These guys become majority text when they're coming against the Textus Receptus. And so TR people have always acknowledged that there has been some readings. Most of the readings are, the majority text. Most of the readings are backed up by the majority of manuscripts. But every now and then there's a reading which we recognize has dropped out of the Byzantine corpus. And so we understand that, and we look at the entire variety of evidence. So we look at the early church writers, we look at the Latin, we look at everything. And so it's really strange. These guys, one of the key things that people like James White and Dan Wallace have taught these guys to do is to become majority text people whenever you're dealing with the Textus Receptus. So the Textus Receptus was called the majority text just because it's based upon the majority of manuscripts. And so if you go back through time, if you were to look at, say, the era of Westcott and Hort, you would say, well, this is the majority text rather than the minority text of Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. You would look at the rest of it as the majority. And so this name has just stuck. It's become the majority text. There's a lot of names for the Textus Receptus, the Syriac Vulgate, or the Greek Vulgate, the Syriac text, the Constantinopolitan text. There's a whole bunch of names for the Textus Receptus, and one of them was the majority text. Now, that doesn't mean that all the readings in the TR are based on majority text. It's just a roundabout, ballpark sort of term. And so, it's like saying the Syriac text or something like that, and saying, what, does every Syriac reading back up the Textus Receptus? Well, no, there's going to be variants and things like that. It's not absolute definitive label. And so these guys love labels. Yeah, as you can tell, they want to call us absolutists. They want to label us as Catholics and Mormons and all the rest of it with their new labels. And they love labeling things and then turning around and attacking you from the position of what they've put as an umbrella term over a bunch of labels. So, they'll label everything is labeled as Textus Receptus. So which Textus Receptus, sort of thing. And, nearly everyone points to this. Others just say, well, it's the underlying Greek text of the King James Version. And, this is close, but we still, believe that it's the King James Bible and that has all the readings. And so, but these guys are like, what about Erasmus's text? That's called the Textus Receptus. What about the Complutensian polyglot guys? That's the Textus Receptus. And they pick different things underneath that umbrella term as, Textus Receptus, and they love to confuse terms. They love to put a label on it and then go, okay, who can we group in that? King James only. Okay, well, here's Jeff Riddle here. Here's Robert Truelove here, and Peter Ruckman will squeeze him in between, and Gail Ripplinger, and see you guys are crazy, sort of thing. So the majority text, basically, Dean John William Burgon, he was rather deceptive in the way that he claimed to be defending the King James, claimed to be defending the TR, but then sort of did an about face and said, well, I'm actually defending the traditional text. Now, I like a lot of his readings, very smart guy, but I don't think he was of the same cloth as someone like Theodore Beza or the King James translators. But he's definitely closer to our side. But see, this is where people can poke holes in what he said, because he didn't defend the Textus Receptus, and he said he found mistakes and all this sort of stuff. And so that's why it's unfortunate that the Dean Burgon Society was named after Dean Burgon, because Dean Burgon wasn't a TR person. He actually created the majority text movement. So he was defending the traditional text. Now, a lot of people think that that's the TR, but it's not. The traditional text is basically the roundabout majority of manuscripts. So then you have people like Miller who worked with him and completed his work, and Herman Hoskier, and these guys are defending that. And so they sort of see the Textus Receptus as sort of roughly around that, but then on this, it's sort of like getting bread and you've got to cut the crusts off, sort of thing. They believe that the Textus Receptus needed fixing and all this sort of stuff. And so that's where we look at that and just say, well, that's just wrong. And so eventually what happened in the 1970s, the majority text movement sort of started creeping in, and people were using the term majority text no longer just as a roundabout sort of term for the Textus Receptus, but they were using it to describe this traditional text that Burgon was talking about. And then you had Pickering and Robinson, and then you had Hodges and Farstead. And so these guys eventually printed Greek texts and named them the majority text. Okay. So it's a bit like having people name, it's like the Message Bible. Now you imagine in the 1970s, if I did a whole series on the message of the Bible, and I'm like, the message of the Bible is this, and the message of the Bible is that, and I'm preaching away. And then 20 years later, someone brings out the Message Bible, and people like James White, Dan Wallace are saying, Nick Sayers is saying that he's preaching the message, but it doesn't line up with the Message Bible. I'd just be like, well, it's not supposed to. This has come afterwards. So the Textus Receptus was labeled the majority text as a roundabout ballpark figure in opposition to the minority text of Vaticanus and Sinaiticus and the rest. And so then it's been labeled, this majority text label has been put upon these new Greek texts that came out in the 1980s and 90s, and they're still coming out, and they don't agree with each other either. But these texts are now the majority text, and they're saying, look, the King James doesn't match up with the majority text. And we're sort of like, okay. And so they're saying, why do you're claiming the King James is based on the majority text? It's like, no, we're claiming the King James before the majority text label came along was called the majority text. So you see how they love to put these labels on things, categorize it, and then demonize you. And these guys, they conflate terms. They don't use categories properly. And, so what they'll do is they'll turn around and say, there are minority readings in the Textus Receptus. And we're like, yeah. And so someone like Edward Hills, he's easily pointed this out. Everyone's pointed this out. Yes, there are readings like 1 John 5:7 that don't have a majority of they don't have the majority of Greek attestation, but it does have the vast majority of Latin attestation, and it's quoted by the early church writers, and there's internal consistency and internal evidence that point to 1 John 5:7 should be in there. And so we've dealt with this for a long time. It's like these guys have this gotcha moment. Like, you guys are saying it's the majority text, but really it's not. And why are these guys all of a sudden becoming majority text people when in the last 12 verses of Mark, 99.999% of the evidence point to those last 12 verses being genuine, and yet they throw them in the bin for two manuscripts, Vaticanus and Sinaiticus? So these guys aren't interested in the majority text at all. These guys are only interested in the majority text when there's places in the Textus Receptus that don't have a majority Greek manuscript attestation. So you can see how they all pretend to be interested in all the Greek texts all of a sudden, when almost everywhere in their text they're just throwing large portions in the bin. The pericope adulterae, it's in the majority, straight in the bin. Last 12 verses of Mark, it's like so much in the majority that it's ridiculous to throw them out in the bin. And then they look at 1 John 5:7, and they won't deal with grammatical issues. They won't deal with things like me talking to Georgios Babiniotis, who's written 6 Greek dictionaries. He's written 200 books on the Greek language. He's a Greek guy in Athens. He's like one of the best living linguists in the Greek language alive today. He probably is the best linguist. And he agrees with me, with Stephen Avery, with others who have brought up the whole issue of Eugenius Vulgaris by saying that there is a solecism in the text when you take the comma out. If the comma is in, there's no solecism. And so these guys just won't deal with that. Most of the time they just mock that, and that they just hide from that. But that's been one of the main arguments for the comma for 200 years, well, since Eugenius Vulgaris said it in 1780. They just want to go the majority because they just want to only talk about the majority text and then back out and talk about something else. And so we're just like, okay, whatever. And so anyway, I just thought I'd say that you got to be careful with these guys conflating majority text with Textus Receptus, claiming that the Textus Receptus is always, every single reading is based on the majority text. We say, oh yeah, it matches up, and obviously the majority text is like 98.5% backs up the Textus Receptus. So it is basically a majority text, but there are the other places where we believe normal textual criticism needs to be done, where we need to look at other things. We need to look at, is there parablepsis, were scribes, skipping lines, adding things to it, like we looked at hotheos in Revelation chapter 1 verse 8. We were looking at that yesterday. And so anyway, I just thought I'd talk about the majority text a little bit, just so you can understand where I'm coming from with that. Image Bearer said, hey, Nick. Hey, Image Bearer. Aaron said, Mark Ward always seems to say his position is being misrepresented. It's like, yeah, no one can understand. See, the thing is, he talks like in riddles, and also he only talks about a certain topic. So it's like, imagine you were talking about the Middle East, but you weren't allowed to talk about the American military. Never mention the American military. But you're trying to talk about politics in the Middle East, and it's like the American military basically shapes politics in the Middle East. Saddam Hussein he worked for the CIA, so did Osama bin Laden. Half of the things that have happened there, the creation of Al Qaeda, these things, it's been admitted. Hillary Clinton admitted that they created Al Qaeda in Afghanistan, and the Mujahideen, they were supported by the CIA, funded by the CIA to come against the Soviets as the heroes in the 1980s, and then they're demonized, and they've become the enemy today, and all this sort of stuff. So that comes from intermeddling with politics from the American military. And when you're a foreigner and you're not influenced by the propaganda and stuff like that, you just look at that and go, okay, that just makes sense. But imagine if I wasn't able to talk about that. And said Mark Ward, he's disallowed himself to talk about textual variations and talk about manuscript evidence, and he's like, no, let's not talk about that. Let's just talk about the readability of the King James. So he's narrowed it down to this tiny little thing, and it's like, you're just not getting the big picture, Mark. And so then he's like, oh, you just don't understand where I'm coming from. And it's like, no, we do understand where you're coming from, but you're only saying half the story, not even half the story. You're sort of like saying 5% of the story, and there's 15 elephants in the room there with you. Why don't you mention them? Why don't you hold them to the same standard that you hold us to? We're all bombastic, and we're all uncharitable heretics. Why don't you look in your own backyard and point out the heretics? Why don't you look at Tommy Wasserman, Jennifer Nust? Why don't you look at some of the bizarre things that Dan Wallace has been saying lately about the text? Why don't you look at James White and point out his insane behavior towards TR people? At the end of the day, that is exactly right. Mark Ward is constantly saying he's being misrepresented, but he's just not acknowledging that many King James people, we know that there's hard readings. He's just stating the obvious. It's like he comes into the room and goes, there's hard readings in the King James, and Trinitarian Bible Society turns around and goes, yeah, here's a list. D.A. Waite's like, yeah, here's my defined King James Bible. I'm like, okay, well, I've done the King James Version 2016 edition. Here you go. And he's joining the party like, it's a new thing. It's an old Bible. Look at this hard word here. Look at this hard word there. And we're like, yeah, that's not really the issue. The issue we're looking at is the text. That's why people endure some of the archaisms and things like that in the King James, is because we see it's a superior text. It's got all the words. He's like, here, have an NIV. And we're like, it's got half a verse is chopped out here. This has got brackets around these 12 verses. We don't want all that, So, but he refuses to deal with textual issues, which is, for most people, is the main thing. For most people, that is the whole reason why. It's not the prose of the English and all this sort of stuff. It's because we recognize that the words are gone in these Bibles, or they're morphed, or they're changed, or they're distorted. And so, great comment there. Hudson said, hi, Nick. Hi, Hudson. Welcome to the stream.
Seeing all those passages, of course, mentioned on Facebook by people who cannot read Greek or certain.
By people who cannot read Greek, like look at that slanderous accusation. Even Stephen Henderson reads Greek. I don't know if you've gone through his videos. He's got 30 lessons on Greek, and I went through them, and I was like, wow, this guy, he knows his stuff. And if you go through like Brett Mahan, he's got amazing credentials. Like, he's been a friend of mine on Facebook for a long time, just throwing little tidbits here and there, and we'd have a discussion. But he's come out recently and just been like, here's all my credentials. And I'm like, this guy is like up there. And, the guys from the Confessional Bibliology group, they ran a Greek learning course for a year. And lots of it, there was like, 50 people involved or something, and lots of them had already learned Greek years and years ago. So we're talking about, when I go through my Textus Receptus Academy group and I'm talking to people, some of these guys are like, yeah, I did 4 years of Greek. Yeah, I studied Hebrew for 2 years, and they have credentials. And so, and they're on Facebook chatting away and saying stuff. But they're not like Mark Ward, just putting a banner over their life and just saying, I know this and I know that. He's just saying that basically everyone on Facebook who's talking about these verses that Timothy Berg's brought up, they don't know Hebrew and they don't know Greek. I mean, it's just ridiculous. This is just ridiculous. This is slander. This is just lies. I mean, I could go to my Textus Receptus Academy group and just say, how many people here know Greek? And many times people are saying, what about this Greek word? What about that one? And they're talking about in-depth grammatical issues. They're talking about in-depth issues with Hebrew. My friend who's done the King James or KJV today.net website, he knows Greek and Hebrew. He's a polyglot. He's a very intelligent guy. Now, he chooses to remain anonymous, and that's fine. And I've had people begging me for years to reveal his identity, but I won't. But he's a great guy. He's very intelligent. And even like Brad, he's like, who is this guy? I want to know. And I'm like, I can't tell you. But and even Will Kinney, like 10 years ago, used to jump into chat rooms and they'd say, you don't know any Greek, you don't know anything. And so Will was just like, okay, well, I'll learn Greek, because he's a Spanish teacher. So he just learned Greek. So he actually knows the Greek now. And so here's like even Peter Ruckman, he knew Greek. D.A. Waite, he knew classical Greek. When you listen to D.A. Waite's stuff that I would have listened to like in the 90s and in the noughties and stuff like that, I don't listen to him much anymore. But you listen to his Bible studies and sermons, he is like every second word that comes out of his mouth when he's doing a Bible study is, here's the Greek word, here's where else this Greek word appears in the New Testament. Here's some secular writings that talk about this Greek word. Let's move on. And then he's constantly doing that. And he was specifically doing that to come against the whole concept of, the King James only people never go to the original languages. And he was constantly going to the original languages. So this is just a lie. Now, let's hear this again. Okay, so let's just hear what Mark Ward says.
Who's been part of this stream are just ignoring that historically they didn't come into the Greek text until 1516.
I've literally seen all those passages, of course, mentioned on Facebook by people who cannot read Greek, or certainly Latin.
Yeah.
Well, Jeff Riddle can read Latin. Larry Brigden, Trinitarian Bible Society, was chatting with him. He speaks Latin. So we were all working with the Revelation 16:5 issue. And so he wanted to bring out a book on that. I'm not sure if he's still doing that or whether he feels that my book answers that. But, yeah, it's...
They just do not know the history.
Yep.
And
we just don't know the history. Mark was just a slanderer. When it comes down to it, he is just a slanderer. He doesn't care about the truth. He just cares about your team's bad, my team's good, like it's a game of football. And he's just waving his flags, saying, "We're the better team. You guys suck." And who's not interested in the facts, Mark? Why you're talking about original languages and stuff like that? Okay, we'll deal with Georgios Babiniotis's argument. Deal with what he said, and deal with Eugenius Vulgaris and his argument. You won't do that because you probably don't even know what they're talking about.
And if they're interested in truth, which is what we said we're pursuing here, then they need to acknowledge it. So,
see, notice this whole thing. It's like, these people, they don't know Greek, they don't know Hebrew, And if they're interested in truth, they need to acknowledge it, you know. So what he's saying is, and he does this all throughout his videos, he's just constantly just belittling people. So he's basically saying no one knows Greek, no one knows Hebrew. Well, he actually said Latin. I thought he said Hebrew, but Latin. And, you know, Jeff Riddle knows Latin. I would love to see, I would really love it if, say, Mark, maybe what I should do is do a video where I talk about people's credentials and get them on the show and just say, okay, so what are your credentials? And, you know, get some original language documentation on the screen, and, you know, we read through it and go, okay, well, because you know, he's making out that no one in his King James only land knows anything. And I'm like, what planet are you living on? You know, I understand there are people who are living in the back blocks of wherever, backwoods, you know, USA, and they've got a southern twang, and they're driving around in their F100, and they're like, Mark, King James Barber, and they don't know anything about the languages and things like that. But I thought you were repenting of labeling us like that. I thought you were trying to be charitable and stop, you know, slandering us in that way, and pull every individual aside and say, okay, what does this person know, and how much do they know about this language, and, you know, do they know Latin, do they know Greek, do they know Hebrew? Because there are many within what they're labeling as these absolutists who do know these things, and I'm just shocked that he's saying this. And so and at the end, listen to this.
Book by people who cannot read Greek or certainly Latin.
Yeah.
They just do not know the history.
And see, what's amazing, well, this shows the height of their hypocrisy. Like Andrew Brown, he was part of the Trinitarian Bible Society. So he is the one who's translated the Latin for what Timothy Berg's talking about. So that people have taken turns in, you know, translating the Latin and also writing commentaries on Erasmus's material. So Andrew Brown worked for the Trinitarian Bible Society. He was like one of the main guys, and he's the one who's done this edition that Timothy Berg's saying, you know, there's a page and a half or 2 pages or whatever of Erasmus talking about the comma, and it's done by the Trinitarian Bible Society. So he knows Latin and he knows Greek, and it's like Mark Ward he's just not connecting the dots anywhere. He just, you know, sitting on the sideline like, yeah, they're all just dimwits, they're all just country bumpkins, you know. And anyway, what does he say next?
And if they're interested in truth, which is what we said we're pursuing here, then they need to acknowledge it. So,
yeah, if we're interested in truth, and in many of his videos, he will say, because, you know, I find, or what he does, he finds one person who will listen to him, or who will say, oh, okay, you've made a good point in that one thing, Mark. And he'll get on his video and say, I found a King James onlyist who will listen to me, who didn't misrepresent me or call me nasty names on the internet. I found one person who's interested in truth. I found one King James onlyist who's not a slanderer and who's not an idiot. And it's like, so what he's basically saying is everyone else is a liar. He's exalting this one guy up, and, you know, he's gaslighting. He's just passive aggressive. And so anyway, so image bearer sort of got on my high horse there, but it was a lie. Mark Ward has lied there. He needs to apologize, really. He needs to apologize to all the people who are in the Textus Receptus movement, King James movement, who can speak Greek. He needs to apologize to Will Kinney. He needs to apologize to Jeff Riddle. He needs to apologize to Brett Mahan. He needs to apologize to Chris Thomas. He needs to apologize to a multitude of people who can look at Greek and read it fluent. I mean, even Taylor DeSoto, these guys, they did a whole video on going to Greece and using the Textus Receptus to preach to people. And they went around and did that. It's like, well, they don't know the languages. It's a big issue I see with Mark's position, yet he always brings it up, is his out of context use of 1 Corinthians concerning intelligibility in worship. And that's the thing. We have used some verses to imply that that Jesus, he believed in preservation, and sometimes it's not the main reason why Jesus has said a verse, but it's implied there that that is the norm. So I brought up the example of Paul saying, Jesus Christ, born of a woman in Galatians. Why would you say born of a woman? Isn't everyone born of a woman? Well, this goes back to Genesis, where it says the seed of the woman, talking about the virgin birth. It's not the seed of a man. The man is the seed of the woman. And so talking about Jesus Christ. And so when he says born of a woman, it's not just, born into this world. It's like, this is a very specific thing in prophecy. And so, but he says it just a matter of factly, like people should really know what I'm talking about there. And they would have known. They would have gone, okay, well, that's what he's talking about. So some of the verses, and Jeff Riddle's brought this out in Psalm 12 and in, the Jots and Tittles verse and other places, heaven and earth will pass away, my word shall by no means pass away. Yes, Jesus is talking about eschatology. Yes, Jesus is talking about something else, but things are implied on the main narrative might be talking about something else, but he's just mentioned on the side, and Jesus does this a lot. He'll just mention on the side that, oh yeah, by the way, I and my Father are one. By the way, this and that, and he'll just mention a bunch of things that become theologically important to us, but that wasn't the direct thing that he was dealing with. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. And so, but then Mark Ward uses 1 Corinthians chapter 14, and he's saying, well, in a roundabout way, it's about intelligibility, and about understanding things. And I understand what he's trying to get at, but the level of understandability is a language that someone understands nothing about. Like imagine, someone was just speaking Chinese Mandarin in front of you. They're just, I won't give you a bad example of that, but someone just sitting here just going, just saying a whole bunch of stuff you don't understand. That's what 1 Corinthians is talking about, that type of level of unintelligibility. And when you read the preface of the King James translated, that's what they're saying as well. They're saying that that's the level of unintelligibility that 1 Corinthians is talking about. Mark Ward is talking about, you read through a chapter of the Bible, and if there's 3 archaic words in there, it's in the bin. And that's not what we would say is unintelligible. And you can look these words up, and it's not that hard to figure out. And the thing is, too, you imagine being in the Byzantine era, where you've got a text that you have traced back to early days. Even if these guys were to agree, it would go back to Chrysostom or 400 or whatever. We believe it goes back earlier. But you've got this text, and then you're reading it in the year 1200. I'm sure that a lot of terminology changed in the Greek Empire. That's why knowing the history of the Greek language, words like koinonia changed and morphed and came, many times this word would mean the whole entire church, and many times it meant communion, many times it meant who was saved. And so things morphed and changed, and so, but they kept those same words. And so here we are, we've only got a 400-year Bible, and we might have to understand that things have changed and morphed and gone in different directions, but we can still look back at Reformation literature and work out what these words are. We can still go back and just grab a dictionary. Half the time, probably about 90% of the time, the words that if you just type in the word into Google and write archaic, you'll get it. Or go to etymology.com, you'll get it. And it's not hard to do. It's very easy to do. And so Mark Ward's just making it out that this is just the worst situation ever. And so that's not what 1 Corinthians is talking about. So very good point there. image bearer. Okay, so where are we?
The King James translators come into a situation of some fluidity because there isn't a perfect standard. There is a congealed, close to consistent standard. There aren't huge numbers of differences among.
So you notice instead of the standard got tighter and tighter, and things got more narrower because they're getting closer to the original readings, it's congealed. It's just like, oh, we can't move from that reading, as if Beezer couldn't just turn around and say, hey, you know, this reading it's not matching up and all the rest of it. They could do that. They were in the process of doing that. And so they're making out that there's, you know, things are congealed because, you know, Timothy Boyce given this pretty poor example of, you know, theos, you know, that he apparently Erasmus couldn't read that. I mean, I could read it straight away. And he was saying it was a fancy type of ligature. It's like, not really. It's just the letter theta. And so you have to go back to the last video to see what I'm talking about there. But yeah, and then that has continued. This error has continued through Stephanus, like as if Stephanus, you know, he made like 400 changes between his text and Erasmus's 1535 text, as if he went to that, you know, Revelation, you know, chapter 1 verse 8 and just went, I'm not allowed to change that because of pressure. No, he would have changed it if it was warranted to change, like he did with his other 400 places. You know, and Beezer, he made changes to the text of Stephanus, and he would have changed that if it was warranted. These guys were studying these things. It's not as if, see, these guys in their mind, because they know so little about the Textus Receptus, these guys in their mind think that, you know, they're just like, okay, let's look at Erasmus. And they just went back to Erasmus. No. If you look at the editions of the TR, and I might even just quickly pull this up. I'll just open a page here. Okay, so I'll go to my main page, Textus Receptus. Let's look at some of these editions. Okay. Actually, it doesn't show it that well here. I might go to Matthew 1. And I'll just show you the editions of the Textus Receptus. Okay, here we go. And so you've had the Complutensian Polyglot come along. So they were comparing Erasmus's with the Complutensian Polyglot. And so it's as if they wouldn't know that there's a difference between the Complutensian and Erasmus at Revelation 1a, because Complutensian says Hotheos there. Then they had the Aldine one in 1518. And they're like, oh, they didn't even realize that it was Erasmus's own text. And, you know, he was patting himself on the back, like footnoting himself. And, you know, the whole slipping on a banana peel situation, they're the Three Stooges that, you know, Erasmus is just tricking himself, you know, what a load. Then you have Cephalus. And so Wolf Cephalus, he did an edition in 1524. And so they would have known about that, looked at that, and thought about that. So then you've got the 5 editions of Erasmus, and you got 5 editions. These would have been, the 5 editions would have been sprawled out on Stephanus's desk, on Theodore Beezer's desk. They would have been looking at these things. Then you had Collinnaeus in 1534. And he was actually the father-in-law of Stephanus. So he had been writing this stuff since 1534. That's even before the final edition of Erasmus. Then you have Cessa. He did an edition in 1538. Then you start the Stephanus stuff. So he worked on the Latin, and then he did 4 editions. And so then you have Theodore Beza comes on the scene, and he's writing a Latin edition. But so what you realize is, if you go through, you can see that he did, like he worked with Tremellius with the Syriac New Testament, with Beza's Greek and Latin introduced. So they're actually doing translation work into Latin, into Syriac. They're translating Bibles. Theodore Beza was one of the main guys behind the Geneva Bible. And so they knew how these things translated out. They knew how words went from different languages from one language to another, for how Latin was translated, how Greek was translated, how they agreed with each other. That's why they did these diglots, Theodore Beza did diglots, and so did Erasmus. And the Plantin polyglot, 1584, Elias Hutter, he did what's called a dodecaglot, a 12-language Bible, which has Greek in it. It has the Hebrew New Testament, has the Syriac New Testament, and he was an expert in Hebrew himself. And so the 1599 is invaluable for the King James translators to look at. And so it's almost like they just have this, okay, we've got Erasmus, and then we've got Stephanus and Beza, and they just copied each other through here. It's like, no, you had a lot of independent people doing editions as well. And they can't just say, okay, the Plantin polyglot is this text. And the thing is, when you go through and people try to, claim, oh, this text is exactly the same as this text, I've gone through and examined areas, and I've found differences where people are claiming things are the same. And so there's a whole generation of people knowing Greek, knowing Latin, and bringing out editions. And so just to say that they got congealed, it's like, oh, we're stuck here in the mud because, Erasmus, he made a reading in the beginning and we can't change from that foundation. No, they were looking at the work Erasmus did, bringing it back to the anvil and hammering it again and saying, well, actually, in this area, I think that he should have had this reading. And half the time it's in his annotations where he talks about these differences. And so, anyway, so I'll just jump back to the video.
TR editions. But if I judge correctly, I think translators can and must have a harder job than, sorry guys, but textual critics. Because a textual critic like Erasmus can feel reasonably confident that most of the people who are going to be reading his text have sufficient education to understand the textual annotations. But the King James translators they say they're doing this work for the very vulgar. Whether they succeeded or not, we can let others judge, but they've got to make choices that people can't come along, and there's not the same opportunity to communicate some textual uncertainty. They actually did have textual annotations in the margin, so they did do that sometimes. They said some copies to read this or that instead of what's in the text, but they've got to choose. They've got to do textual criticism, and it's going to go into English. So
basically what they want to do is create a platform here where they say what they want to do is make out that every marginal note is like an uncertain reading. It's putting doubt on the original reading. And so you're reading through the text, it has a little note and it says, well, the Hebrew says this. And then you're like, I don't know what that reading is. When you understand that the vast majority of notes are there to show people where either the English translations have such a large difference that people will notice it, and they'll think that the King James translators have made a mistake, so they have a note to say, look, we understand that this, the previous Geneva and bishops and others have this reading, so it will just say all this, or some versions say this or whatever. Other times it's where Greek and Hebrew, if you just have a basic understanding of these languages, you can get the wrong idea a lot of the time. And so they would have been dealing with who was Hugh Broughton, who, expert in Hebrew, but he's sort of like, how you get these Hebrew Israelites. And so the Hebrew Israelites, blah, 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 they try to squeeze these Hebrew words into Bibles, and it'll be like, no, you have to say Yahweh every time it's Lord. And no, you have to, call Jesus this certain term. And, they'll, instead of the Holy Spirit, it'll be the Rosh Kadosh and all this stuff. And so there were people back then trying to do that sort of thing. So they would sometimes just put in the margin, okay, this means this. And they were dealing with issues of their day that were in previous English Bibles, previous TR Bibles, TR editions. So sometimes the Stephanus text would have a verse missing. So they have to acknowledge that in their margin and say, well, some editions have omit this. And they're just dealing with the facts in their day. And so this is normal textual criticism, okay? This is a far cry from like, okay, Westcott and Hort have made this Frankenstein monster. It doesn't even have the same DNA or anything. Here's 40,000 footnotes, sort of thing in the New King James. You're trying to just get through one verse and there's like 2 footnotes there and you're like, oh my God. But especially like the Net Bible. And so these guys had to deal with what they had, what they were facing in their day. And so they were dealing with a bunch of older English versions, a bunch of older TR editions. They were dealing with people's misinterpretations of the Hebrew and the Greek. They were dealing with Roman Catholic concepts that people were reading into the text. And they were dealing with people who had little education in some of these languages, who would think that the Hebrew word means this, and when it can in context change, and so they would mark that in the margin. So these guys try to make out that the King James translator was sitting around and they're all like, oh, how are we going to translate this? It's like, I don't know. Let's just put a marginal note because it's we don't know. No, when Miles Smith talked about this type of thing, when he's saying we're not sure, they were talking about hapex legomenon, I'm pretty sure it's called, which is when you have, sometimes there's only one time a Hebrew word appears in the Bible. And sometimes if it's of an animal, it's like, well, we've done our best to, talk to Hebrews and we've looked at all the versions and all the commentaries and we've come up with this. We hope it's right, but that's the best we can do at the moment. And then, 400 years later, we look back in retrospect and go, you guys actually got it right. Yay. And so it was, unicorn is better than saying, whatever they were going to say. And, it just means, rhinoceros, or the scientific name for a rhinoceros is Rhinoceros unicornus. So, these guys call it a wild ox. It's got 2 horns, and you can tame it. It says in Job, you can't tame the ring. And so, anyway, I'll just read this. It says Mark's position is especially interesting given his job at Faith Life. You can simply select a word in the digital King James, and without leaving the passage, read the definition of any word. Yeah, that's interesting. And so, why isn't he just saying, hey, that would be a thing, but that would come against his whole ministry. So they've actually created a tool that you can just hover over a word and it'll give you a definition. And that sort of solves everything. But then his whole ministry crumbles because all he's dealing with, and he refuses to deal with anything else, all he's dealing with is readability. But you can go through the Logos Bible software or whatever's bringing this out. And this tool will help you. Or you can just go through, have the thing in your lap and just look on your phone and go, I wonder what this word means. Type it in. There you go. Fixed. And that's a really good point there. It's quite funny that his Faith Life, they've done this, but Mark Ward seems to be silent on it because why let those pesky facts that it's that easy get in the way of his huge anti-King James ministry?
Talk to me about the story of the King James. When it came to textual criticism, what did they think they were doing?
Good. One of the first things we need to recognize about how the KJV or KJV translators work is that they're not all sitting together all at once, coming to consensus in a big room.
No, they.
Okay, so this is another thing that James White does, and I've noticed these guys continuously do. They try to separate all the King James translators. So you had the 6 committees. They're like, oh, one was in Cambridge and one was in Oxford, and you got Westminster over here. And, they didn't have telephones. They didn't have email, and all this, as if they just could never reach each other. And the thing is, too, why did they all need to communicate like that? When you understand the way that they did the version, they did it in a certain way where they were to work as their team, and then they would give their information to others. So they weren't able to do that or something, they weren't in this big room all together and just this one mind thinking. And these guys are the ones who believe in the LXX. We think the LXX is just the 5th column of Origen's hexapla. But they're trying to get the stories that are around the LXX and put it on to the King James translators.
They were in 72 separate rooms, all working on the entire Bible.
It's funny you shared that story earlier about the 70.
Now listen to how radical Timothy Berg's King James only view was when he grew up. So this is what he thinks he's coming in. This is what he thinks some of you guys are.
2 translators all separately going out, coming to a perfect translation, coming together, and finally they all agreed. I heard that story as a young man. That was, and I wouldn't charge anybody else with saying this, but that was my mom's understanding of how the KJV was done. She had read that story and somehow misinterpreted it as about the King James, and so she claimed that they all separately went and provided individual translations, came back together, and miraculously all agreed word for word.
So this is the stuff that he's grown up with. So this is like growing up in a cult, it's like growing up, in a Jehovah's Witness type of thing. And no wonder you have problems today with people who are labeled King James only. You've sort of labeled a whole bunch of people King James only. When your mum has believed this type of weird stuff, it's, often like Timothy Berg wrote an article. It was, the 5 reasons or 5 misconceptions, common misconceptions about the King James Bible. And so this was on the Text and Canon website. And as he was bringing these out, it was like, this isn't a common misconception. But he's like, I know people who are like that. And I know even Brian Ross was saying, well, I actually know people who are like this and like that on some of them. But there was like 3 that were just sort of like, the King James floated down on a cloud. Okay, I know I've heard people say that, mockingly, sort of like saying, people think Paul used the King James. It was just something really dumb, like something that's just a mockery. It's not a real position. And so when you read through his article, it's sort of like, okay, I can see maybe 2 or 3 points you've made there, but the other ones are like, why even mention it? They're not common things about the King James. So I just found that really strange. And so, but when you listen to his upbringing, his mum thought that the King James translators all went into separate rooms, translated, and came out with the perfect Bible miraculously. That's what his mum was saying. And she was writing books, and he admitted earlier that she was more full on than Peter Ruckman. And so to me, that's like, I mean, this is traumatic to him. This has been him growing up in that environment. It's like, that is so bizarre and traumatic and weird. And then he's come out of it and he's like, well, I'll go with these guys. I won't go with TR people or KJV defenders who are just normal. I'll go with the critical text guys because I just want to get as far away from that sort of weirdness as possible. So Image Bearer said, Mark's position is especially interesting given... Oh, yeah, sorry, I read that. Helge said, Mark Ward answered me in the comments section and admitted that 1 Corinthians 14 passage was used by him out of context, yet he continues to use it. Yeah, absolutely. I find some of these guys, it doesn't really matter what you say to them. They have a barrow to push, and they're going to push it no matter how many times you point out that the contents of what they've got is flawed. Image Bearer said he had a similar experience. Yeah, we should have a counter for every strawman anecdote that gets demolished by this group. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so many strawmen that come up with these guys that it's just ridiculous. And yeah, it's sort of a shame to see. And I guess because a lot of us have gone through James White's material, and we've come out the other end saying, okay, well, you know, let's put it into perspective here. He's lied about this. He's misrepresented these people. He said this. He said that. And so these guys are sort of repeating that and rehashing a whole bunch of stuff and adding things to it. And so this is sort of like nothing new to us. We can see straight through it because they're just sort of rehashing old arguments but giving it new labels. And so it's quite easy to demolish what they're saying. I used to think little men heated my food in the microwave. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that, you know, you could, I'm sure that Timothy growing up in that household, that explains why he has gone down a certain road. That would, yeah, wouldn't that be, in a sense, like he's not coming to the table with a neutral mindset. If your mother, who you love, has this type of concept and these bizarre, you know, ideas, obviously you want to help her. You want her to get out of that mindset. It's like growing up with someone who's thinking that aliens are real, you know, and you're like, you become the main guy against aliens sort of thing. There's a conflict of interest in a sense, you know. Well, I guess, how can I word this? I can't think of any parable. Anyway, I retracted that one, but gladly you understood my point. Or did you delete it and it still turned up here for everyone to see? That'll be like Judgment Day. We'll be like, God, didn't you delete that? And he's like, no, every word that you say you'll be accountable for. It's like, every word? Please, God.
So if you've ever edited an academic volume, you know that the real miracle in that story is that they all met the same deadline.
True.
That is true.
You make a good point, because especially, and that's today with email and computers and text messaging where we can connect so closely. They didn't have any of that.
I mean, I just, if you're working with the people who are involved in the translation, you don't need all that. If you're meeting weekly with, you know, 9 other people and you're working on this, why do you need these other 60 people? If there was like 1,000 people who worked on it, did they all have to connect to each other? I mean, having say 10 people in one committee, that's a lot of people. That's enough to do like the work like the Bishop's Bible, or, you know, most of the previous Bibles didn't have that many people working on it for just one committee. Yeah, but they've got to make it like, oh, it's not enough. They've got to have this connectivity, and they should have all been together, you know, sort of thing. And they didn't have email, and, you know, they're living all in England. You know, I mean, to get a letter to one other place might have taken a day or two, but it's like, is this really this huge big hindrance? If you're sitting next to someone like Lancelot Andrews, and you're like, okay, so what's the Dutch word for that again, Lancelot? Da, 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 you know, oh, okay, and they're sitting there with all these language Bibles, with all the editions of Erasmus open, and they're all just chatting about this. And they're saying, well, last night I just read through, the book of Romans in Latin, and I noticed that this Latin text of Erasmus differs from this one, and this word was used here. And you see in their notes that they know this stuff like the back of their hand. Why do you need everyone to come in and give you that information? It's like if you want to study rocket science, you don't need 1,000 teachers to cram into a room to teach you that. You just need, 1 or 2 good teachers to teach you this. Why do they all need this interconnectivity? But then it's coming against the way the King James was translated. And so these guys in all 6 committees, just say there's 10 in each committee, they were to translate the Bible by themselves. So they did 10, each one of them did 10 editions of the portion that they were going to do. So say if they were doing the Gospels and the book of Revelation, like Henry Saville and people who were in his committee, like say, let's just look at one translator. Henry Saville, he would have gone through from Matthew till the end of John and done the book of Revelation, and he did his own edition. He gave that to the other 9 guys. They looked at it, and they'd already done their own edition. Then they had to amalgamate that edition into one. Then they sent that one edition off to the other groups, and they evaluated it, sent it back with notes and suggestions and things like that. Then they evaluated it again, and then that was given to the final committee board. And so and then there's this other process that goes through that, and then other people were looking over the whole entire text, making sure that things were smooth. And so that, to me, that's huge, and that is well documented history. But they're bringing up the LXX guys, and and James White will just constantly say that one committee just had one idea, and they were just using Erasmus's text, and the other committee, they were using Beza's text, and they couldn't agree with each other, and they just don't know the history of the text, and they don't understand that these guys, like say Lancelot Andrews, Henry Saville, John Boyce, they were all working on the Chrysostom text, the entire works of Chrysostom. They were working on that at the same time. So that's like the side project. So they're doing translation work, but they're going through Chrysostom at the same time. So these guys know each other many times. They're getting together doing other things. And so, the whole thing of the King James translators weren't connected enough. That's just another ploy to basically say that, having 60 of the world's greatest linguists, Bible translators all together wasn't enough. We needed sort of more, or we needed technology, sort of thing. It's ridiculous. This is, and they're trying to liken this to like the myth of the LXX, but when you go through the way that they did it, if anyone was going to do a proper Bible translation, they would do it the way that these guys did. It's almost flawless. How can you've got so many cross checks? Obviously the MEV with you guys probably know what I'm talking about when I talk about the reward reading. They just saw reward in Isaiah chapter 58 verse 8 in the King James, and they thought it said reward instead of reward, and they wrote reward there. And no other Bible has this. They obviously didn't go to the Hebrew. They didn't go to Latin. They didn't go to other, even New King James or anything. They just went, it says reward, So this is a ridiculous reading, and it shows that only probably one guy made that mistake. You wouldn't expect all 47 of their translators, however many they had. They say they had 47. And so it just shows you they didn't do cross checks and balances. But Mark Ward will recommend that Bible. But the King James, they didn't do a good enough job.
And they're dividing in the first stage of their work. The King James Bible is produced over 3 broad stages. And in the first stage of their work, they're separating into 6 small teams at Westminster, Cambridge. I just went blank. Oxford, Cambridge, and Westminster. And so they're in separate little rooms with 8-10 people at most. Sometimes maybe 3 or 4 at most.
8-10 people at most. It's like that's a lot of when when you read through the biographies of these guys, you've got people who, like Henry Saville taught the Queen Greek, Queen Elizabeth. He's not a dummy. To have that one guy. I mean, the Bible translation, say like the ESV. I've watched that clip where they talk about doulos and slavery and things like that. They're just sort of putting their hand up and giving their opinion. Can you imagine someone like, Henry Saville is on your team, and he's like, well, I've been teaching, Greek for the last 40 years to the royal family, and this is what I think. And I've actually we're going through the works of Chrysostom. Chrysostom says this, the early church writers say this is in the context of how this Greek word works. And he's working in that field and this is just one guy. He's just diminishing the amount of King James translators. He's diminishing the scholarship of these guys. See, if you get one guy who's absolutely brilliant, like Lancelot Andrews, he's worth 50 of the modern translators. You know what I mean? If you were to get one of those guys to sit on the committee today, that most of these guys would absolutely outshine modern translators. I've heard them. I mean, even Bart Ehrman, he recently came out and said that modern text critics don't really know the text like the King James translators did. He said, they didn't have TV back then, and they were giving themselves over to these languages at a young age. And so when they got older, they were just reading through early church writing. So the thing is, like, these guys are saying, all of Erasmus's work is being translated into English and we have access to it. Well, if you can read the Latin, you've always had access to it. And so, and that's the thing. People who, like the King James translators, they just read through Erasmus's annotations like it was English. And so they knew the Latin. I mean, there's really no dispute that they all knew Latin. They all knew Greek. But then it comes down to, okay, well, say Miles Smith, he was an expert in Arabic. He wrote an Arabic dictionary. Then you got other people, who revised, the Persian language, and Lancelot Andrews, 21 languages, 15 European ones, 6 languages that would be considered, old, deader languages, in a sense. But anyway.
They have different editions of the Bible. Somebody in one room may well have a copy of Erasmus. Somebody in another room may well have a copy of Stephanus.
Can you believe this? So there's only like a few of them in each room, and one of them's like, hey Bob, I've only got Erasmus here. I've only got Erasmus. What are you reading? It's like, I left my Stephanus at home. It's like, okay, Bob. They're just trying to make out these, like, the top-notch scholars of this era were just dimwits and didn't have all the full resources. I mean, these guys had access to everything. We're talking about the King of England, right? Commissioning these guys to do this. This isn't just sort of like, this isn't a backyard project. You're working, you're trying to pull an engine out of a car or something and, hot it up. That these guys, they already know their stuff. They've come to this table learned already. How did they get learned? By reading through all the editions of Erasmus and Stephanus and all these other. They would have had Hutter's dodecaglot in front of them. They would have had these things. These guys have, got these bookshelves behind them with a whole bunch of books. I mean, the King James translators had access to libraries. Like, you look at, like, even John Boyce, he had one of the most expensive libraries in Europe, but he didn't have, Stephanus's text. And this is why I just see the motivations of Timothy Berg as disingenuous. When he comes up with this sort of rubbish, it's like you're just saying things that just aren't true. You're just lying. And I expect this sort of stuff, when I read, like, there's some really interesting books. Like, you might get like The Cradle King Story of King James, other ones that I've got, like Majesty or Power and Glory, God's Secretaries, etc. Interesting reads, but usually they sort of do the same thing. Like the translators were just sort of bozos, and but then they can't get around the fact that people will say that they were legendary. These guys were amazing. They knew their stuff, but then there's always these type of anecdotal things. Oh, they didn't have the connectivity that we have today with email, and they probably, one was probably reading Stephanus and the other one was probably reading Beza, and so they just sort of fumbled around. No, if you're going to make a text, if you're going to do the Gospels and then you're going to all translate that, you have to be in agreement about what text you're translating. It can't just be like, okay, guys, just go for it. It's like, okay, well, we're going to be working off Beza's 1598. There's a few places where we think the text needs amending. And so all up throughout the whole translation, there's only like 20 places like that. So they would have thought about that. They would have worked it out. When they're sending their text to the other team, do you think they, wouldn't have gone, hey, in this place, this is where we have departed from the 1598 of Beza? Or do you think you just leave it up to them to go, oh, they've made a mistake here, or whatever? It's like, no, they knew their stuff. They knew what they were doing. They had access to everything. It clearly says, and see, the thing is, these guys love to go to the translators to the reader. Now, I'll just show you what they are not saying. Okay, so okay. Now, this might take a tiny little bit of time, but I thought I'd bring this up because I was going through this the other day, and I just thought, so this is at the beginning of the King James Bible. So they go through, the translators to the reader, and many times they're not reading this bit. Okay, so because Timothy Berg is constantly saying, oh, it's just a revision of the Bishop's Bible, and you hear people say this. It's something that Norton brings out a lot, and as I pointed out in Norton's book, he never mentions Theodore Beza once, but he mentions the Bodleian 1602 like 500 times. And so these guys are trying to make out that the King James is just a revision, that they never really went to the Greek, and so or the Hebrew. And so what you see is it's just an attack, because the beginning of the King James says translated out of the original tongues. The reason that they had the bishops as a platform was because they had to have guidelines. It's like, okay, so which Bible are we going to be like? Are we going to be like Tyndale? Are we going to be like the Great Bible? Are we going to be like Coverdale? Are we going to be like the Geneva Bible? And they're like, well, we think the bishops has that good foundation. We think it's the way that things are set out there is good. So what we'll do is we'll go with that as a platform, except for where the Hebrew and the Greek differ. Obviously, that's why we're doing a new translation, because we want to make it so this translation is accurate to the original languages. See, that's the thing that these guys don't really mention much, because they want to sort of make out that we're just going to the Bishop's Bible and we're just sort of updating that. And instead of, no, the Bishop's Bible is like a draft copy, and they depart from that a lot. And so I've noticed this, say, in Brian Ross's work as well, where he's sort of gravitating towards the thing. And sometimes I'm like, well, he'll say, oh, yeah, this is a reading that they've incorporated from here and there. And I'm like, no, that's just the reading of the 1598 of Beza. Go to Beza, look at his Greek, look at his Latin, look at his annotations, and you can see that. And so I think there is a ploy, there is a push to sort of forget Beza and his 1598, which is pretty much what the New Testament of the King James is based upon. And so, okay, so where are we here? And it's interesting. It talks about which has given such a blow to that man of sin. And he's talking about the Antichrist, the Pope. I love that. Where in modern Bibles it's like, oh, we're in agreement with the Vatican. The Vatican has given us permission for this Bible, the World Council of Churches and the ESV. Okay, so okay. For when your Highness have once out of deep judgment apprehended how convenient it was that out of the original sacred tongues, together, listen to this, with comparing the labors, both in our own, so English, and other foreign languages, of many worthy men who went before us, there should be one more exact translation of the Holy Scriptures into the English tongue. So this is very clear that they went to the original languages, the original sacred tongues, together with comparing the English and other foreign languages. So this is where we get that from. These guys are like, oh, the translators to the reader, have they gone through this, Your Majesty, your King James, did never desist to urge and to excite those to whom it was commended that the work might be hastened, that the business might be expedited. I might have read that wrong. In so decent a manner, expedited? In so decent a manner as a matter of such importance might justly require. So I think that's all I really wanted to read, but it clearly says, and it's interesting, like they talk about popish persons like Roman Catholics. They love the fact that this was coming against Roman Catholics. And they do mention being uncharitable there, but I think it would be in a different context to what Mark Ward thinks is uncharitable. If you just critique him, you're uncharitable, apparently. But yeah, so I'll just sort of point that out, that it was out of the original sacred tongues, the Greek and the Hebrew, with the English, and also foreign languages. So they went to many different sources. And so, so yeah, I just sort of point that out.
They're not all tied to one exact
Different editions of the Greek New
Yeah,
Testament.
different editions of the TR. So they're not all one tied to one edition.
Yeah, I just can't believe he said that. One team had Erasmus, the other team, sorry guys, we've only got one copy of Stephanus here. Which team wants it? And they're all sort of like, me. And it's like, here you go, guys. You can have Stephanus. Who wants Erasmus? And they're like, can we use that? And it's like, yeah, okay, you guys use Erasmus. And just this is how they're trying to make out the King James translation was made. I mean, how do you spell bias?
And what they end up doing, and we can assess this not so much just by what they say, but by looking at their text and what they've done, we look back at what they've done and we realize the end product, whoever was doing what at what stage, the end product doesn't follow any one of those Greek texts exactly.
Well, the issue is they made their own Greek and Hebrew text. And so when he's saying, okay, it doesn't follow exactly, through my research, and also this was the number of D.A. Waite. He said he went through the 190 list of. See, when the Trinitarian Bible Society Greek, when this was made in 1881 by Scrivener, it had you'd be reading along and it would have an asterisk, and it had 190 of these asterisks, and you would go to the back and it had a list of places where he had amended his text from Beza, okay? So, but when you look at it, it's like, hang on, he's sort of, that is just a singular word and a plural word. It's untranslatable. In the context, it becomes plural. So what, he's changed that. And so that's why I've been going through my Scrivener videos, and if you can see my article. If you just Google 190 Beza, my article will come up. or 190 Scrivener, it comes up. And so you can go through there and you're like, well, this is like, you know, a lot of these are unnecessary, okay? And they're not translatable. So D.A. Waite, he said there's only about 20 that are really, that need mentioning out of the 190. So we're looking at like 10%, you know, if we're saying there's 190, just say 200 just to make the maths good. So, you know, you're looking at like 10% of the 190. And I contacted Kirk DeVitro, and he had about the same number. And myself, I've gone through that, and from what I can see, it's sort of like, you know, 1 in every 20 is valid. The rest of them are just not even worth mentioning. Or the Greek might be changed, but if you translate it into English, it doesn't make any difference. And so, so there's only about 20 differences between Theodore Beza's 1598, which I'll just show you right now what that is. So this is Beza's 1598. We can go to Matthew here. I'll make this a little bit larger. Well, I can actually, that's good. And so here we have Matthew, Vivlos Kinesios, Jesu Christo, Weo David, Weo Abraham, Matthew 1:1. Then he has his own Latin translation here. Then he has the Vulgate, and then he's got some footnotes on the side there, or marginal notes. And then he has, like here, Vivlos, you know, and then he talks about, you know, it's related to Genesis 5:1, the Hebrew Sefer Toledoth, and so then he goes on, you know, explaining what Genesis means, you know, son of David, son of Abraham, etc. So this would have been on the desk of every single translator. So we're talking about in the whole entire New Testament, 20 differences, and this might just be one letter on the end of a word, or, and I haven't finished my research yet. You know, I've probably gone about maybe 15% through it. There's quite a lot still I need to do. And so, so I just thought I'd show you the text. This text would have been readily available to everyone. Anyone who, these guys would have had their own copy personally of these guys, like I'll just type in John Boyce library, or maybe I should actually go to my website. I'll just go to TR, and we'll just have a quick look. Now I know that this website is actually made by a bunch of Mormon guys, but I've checked through quite a fair bit of it, and a lot of it is irrefutable, just knowledge that you'd find anywhere. So, King James, I'll just type in translators. Editions, no. Here we go. So this is a great site. So yeah, if you didn't know it was made by Mormons, you would just read through it and go, wow, really interesting. And Mormons, they're not really big fans of the King James, so they're going to be as critical as possible anyway. So it's not like they're going to make these guys out to be, you know, people who they aren't, in a favorable light, I should say. So this has, you know, a list of, like, you know, the Committee of Two, the Committee of Revisers, you know, Westminster Company. So you can go through the biographies of these guys. So let's just look at John Boyce. I'll enlarge this, and let's just type in. He was a diligent student through his life, rising before 4 in the morning until 8 in the evening in the university library. Now, it should say down the bottom here. was hoping it would talk about his own personal library, which was huge. It was worth an absolute fortune. And so if you go through any one of these guys, Samuel Ward, for example, and you read through his biography, you can see these guys came to the table with all their books, with all their learning, and if they didn't have them, of course they would have been able to have access to Theodore Beza's 1598 or his earlier editions, and they had everything before them. I mean, Timothy Berg is just making this up. Anyway, so I think I've bashed that horse to death, but this is amazing. To me, this is just absolutely amazing. Colony of Cells says, Mark Ward seems to see King James Version only everywhere. Yeah, it's like he can smell that there's King James only residue on the mic. He's like, yuck, everyone's sort of, if you're not critical text, you're King James only, deep down, you're a racist, or you're a, anyway, I won't go there.
So the King James translators did textual criticism.
The King James this whole thing of the King James translators did textual criticism, this is a James White concept where, we would be talking about the TR, and we'll be talking about how stupid some of the readings are in modern translations, or especially the Greek and of Tyndale House, or Westcott and Hort, or the Nestle Aland editions, and said, look, this is a stupid reading. The textual criticism here has omitted this verse, but it creates this huge solecism in the Greek. Well, why have you done that? And James White has made out that that King James only, Textus Receptus only people, who he says are basically the same people, that we don't believe that Erasmus did textual criticism, Stephanus, Beza, all the King James translators, that we don't think that they did textual criticism. When clearly, Jeff Riddle, myself, many other people have said, we believe they did textual criticism, that's ridiculous, but we don't think it was the same. And obviously, Grisbach with his rules of translation, Bengel, Luckman, other people have worked on certain rules. When I say translation, I should say compilation of Greek manuscripts, or creation of a Greek text. So their rules of the shortest reading is the best reading, the most difficult reading is usually the correct reading, and all these strange rules. Sometimes that applies, but their rules are different, and they have Vaticanus and Sinaiticus primacy. And so when you look at Luckman, he had Vaticanus primacy, but then when you look at Westcott and Hort, they have Vaticanus and Sinaiticus primacy, and they amalgamated those two together. And so the theories were constantly changing, and now it's like CBGM, and there's a whole bunch of other ways that they're getting the text. But this is not how Erasmus did it. This is not how Stephanus did it. And so, but we go, yeah, they did textual criticism. But if you want to try and equate their textual criticism to today's textual criticism, they're poles apart. It's almost the exact opposite. And so I'll just jump up on my website here, and I'll read what I've got on the front page. Okay, modern textual criticism is focused on a narrowing of the field to a few corrupt and rejected manuscripts, sidestepping the huge amount of Greek and Latin manuscripts and the early church witnesses as unimportant, only to be used when they can be referenced to try and give some support to Vaticanus primacy corruption. It really is an anachronism fallacy, or a false definition, to speak of Erasmus, Stephanus, and Beza to be doing textual criticism, since their value were in general opposite to those of Grisbach, to Hort, to Metzger, to Wallace confusions. They based themselves on mostly the Greek and Latin manuscripts and the early church witnesses, with some faith-consistent, logical, and grammatical type internal evidence considerations. This is essentially the opposite of textual criticism as used today, which has a biased presupposition towards Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. And so they try to make out, they did textual criticism as well. That's all we're trying to do. That's all the, ESV guys are trying to do, or the Nestle Aland guys are trying to do. We're just trying to, do what they did. No, you're doing it. You've tipped the boat upside down. You're doing it exactly opposite to what they did in the Reformation period.
Yes, exactly.
And actually, Scrivener, and we'll get to him later, comes along centuries later, more than 2 centuries later, 2.5 centuries, and carefully, this is the most exacting work. I've always said he's got a Dickensian name, Scrivener the scribe, is sitting down and judging, okay, when Beza and Stephanus disagree, and those were almost certainly in the hands of the King James translators, which one did the King James translators side with? And he actually tallies this up. And although, again, we're going to get to Scrivener later, on my website, the KJVParallelBible.org, I have a page, with the Which TR page.
It's hilarious because that's the one that I always point out that, let's go to it. Let's have a bit of fun. KJV Parallel. This is hilarious because they go to the wrong list, and they go to Scrivener. So the Which TR. So he said to go there, and they got Appendix E. So this is way different. So if you go to my one, you just type in 190 Beza in Google, and it will take you there. I've got the 190 list that was at the back of Scrivener's TR. They have Appendix E. Now, I examined Appendix E. If you go to the bottom of my article page, and you can see, I've got lots of scriptures that I deal with. Now, some of them are empty. Some of them have the information. I haven't made a conclusion yet. But if you go to the bottom of the page, you can actually go and read the Appendix. It's a different list. Okay. And so this is what they've got on their side as a definitive thing about the Textus Receptus. And it's like, you're actually looking at the wrong material. So, and even, Scrivener, he's a genius. He knows this and he knows that. Okay, so let's just quickly go to print. So it should come up. Reprint. A print error. Okay. Yeah, so this is one I was looking at, and it just basically shows that there is a print error here that he didn't recognize, that Scrivener didn't recognize there was a print error. So if you look at the text here, you can see the Hort there. It has the acute symbol, but it also has the breathing mark. But you can see that in the margin there. I'll try and make that bigger. So you can see there, it appears in the margin. Okay, and so Scrivener didn't see that there. He just thought it was the margin. It was a bit of a blob, and so he thought that was missing, and so he's listed that as one of his issues. So he's got the 5th edition, the 1598, only has ha men, and so it doesn't have the acute symbol. So he's put the acute symbol back there. Okay, and so. Yeah, on closer examination, Beza does have that. And so, and I went through and just checked the 1550. It does have that. Here we are. Hoffman has the acute symbol, has the breathing mark. And so it just shows you that Stephanus isn't perfect. He's making mistakes. This is an unnecessary thing. And I guess I'll just quickly look that up in Luke 8:5 in this edition. And so this is where, you know, people are like, oh, we're going to make our own Textus Receptus and all that. Well, they're not doing this type of work. I don't think they can really produce a Textus Receptus with the type of knowledge that they have. They're just relying on what Scrivener's done. And Scrivener's, the more you look at Scrivener, you're like, well, he can be a little bit sloppy here and there. And so the reason that this is good is because it's based on the 1598. Had they just printed the 1598, I mean, that would just be close enough, with maybe a footnote here and there showing where the King James translators had these 20 translatable differences. But okay, so verse 5. Okay, so that's the exact reading that he has changed it to. So he said that he's changed it. Okay, so I'll just get back here. You can see where my finger is there, the Hoffman. And so he has, he said he's changed it, but that's exactly what Beza's read. So he's changed it for no reason. So, and this is one of the 190 list. And so, yeah, I think you can sort of get the drift of, you know, why I'm going through this list, just pointing out, well, that was an unnecessary change, and it's not even a change. It's exactly identical to Beza, so it doesn't even need to be mentioned. You can just say, okay, well, there's a 189 now, and then you go through the next one, like 188 and 180. There's no reason to have this type of change. So anyway, let's go back to, he was going to his you know, which TR thing, and you know, you can compare the Appendix E for yourself. So this has come from Timothy Berg. So Timothy Berg's pointed in the direction of Appendix E. Now, when I was setting up my website, I was confused of where the list of the 190 was, but you know, I think it was in 2010. I figured it out, and I was looking at Appendix E, going, "Oh, is this the same list?" But it's not. And if you go through this, some of it is the same, some of it's different. And, you know, as I've pointed out, there are some mistakes in it. And so, you know, they're going through, the work of Scrivener is the best, and, you know, we rely on that. Well, you've got to go through and do your independent research and go to the original sources. Anyway.
And you can look at Scrivener's work on this. He spells it all out in real detail. He shows 111 passages in which the King James translators chose to follow Beza against Stephanus. Again, we're not talking about massive and significant things here, but some.
And so, like I pointed out, he's saying 111. So some of those are part of the 190 list, some aren't, because he changed his mind when he was doing a definitive at the back of the Textus Receptus Bible sort of thing. Some of the things that are in that list aren't in the 190 list. And so he's actually gone through and gone, I'm wrong there, and he's dropped a few. And they're going with his 111 list. It's not the 190 list. And so, yeah, this is his previous sort of work. Now, I know they did print this edition later on, and they were still working on it, but pretty much the lists remain unchanged.
Some of them are more significant. We'll get into that too. But we're also not talking about the perfect every jot and tittle text.
Exactly. Because
they had to do textual criticism, okay? 111 passages in which the King James translators went with Beza against Stephanus. 59 in which they did the opposite. So they went with Stephanus against Beza. And 67 in which, here's where we can bring in the Latin Vulgate, in which they differed from both texts and went with some other reading.
It's really weird, like James White, or there seems to be a group that basically says that they only went to Beza and Stephanus. Okay, if they went outside of that, it's like it could be the Latin, it could be where did they go, sort of thing. And it's like, and like I've said, only 10% of these are translatable, and so most of it is unnecessary change to the Greek text. If you were to get the text of Beza and translate it into English, you would get exactly the King James, except for 20 places that are translatable. Okay, so the 190 list, it's in Greek, you know, having a breathing mark going one way or the other. Usually it's to do with names. Like Beelzebub, if you have that in, if you have Beelzebul in the Greek, it's still going to translate to Beelzebub in the English. No matter what, if it has Beelzebub or Beelzebul, it's still going to translate the same into English, because one of the rules of the translators was to keep names of people according to how they're generally used and commonly used. But then they'll turn around and say, oh, see, if they've got Beelzebub in the English version, that's from the Latin, because Beelzebub was the way that the Vulgate said it as well. So that they didn't say Beelzebul in England, they said Beelzebub, which is just a cultural Latin influence. It's not, oh, that's from directly from the Vulgate into the King James, but they say, oh, this is a Vulgate reading. You see how sneaky this is? It's deceptive. And so, and this is where, you know, I'd have to go through every single one of Norton's lists of, oh, they've got this from the Vulgate and that from the Vulgate. And most of the time it's like, this is phonetic. These are names. A lot of the 190 list is just names. It's talking about Jerusalem, you know, saying it a different way in Greek, talking about, you know, mostly names. And so
either, and this is what Scrivener says, from the Complutensian Polyglot, from the Latin Vulgate, and from several other Greek New Testament editions, Collinnaeus of 1534, other Stephanus editions, and the Aldine editions, and from various editions of Erasmus. Think of the work it took Scrivener to uncover all this, but it's verifiable. We don't have to know what the King James translators thought they were doing in this aspect. We can just go look at what they did.
Yeah, exactly. And I'll point out, again, the most learned TR and KJV defenders have recognized that. So let me quote E.F. Hills for a moment. He talks about the fact that the TRs differed and that therefore the KJV translators made decisions, textual decisions about which reading to follow. He doesn't deny that that took place. What makes me and Hills, or us and Hills, different isn't a denial that the King James translators did textual criticism. It's whether we believe that textual criticism was done as fallible humans trying to serve and worship God, or as humans specifically guided by God. Here's what he says. He's talking about the marginal notes that
fallible humans, and so they're trying to make out that this is inspired and all this. No, it's these people. If we are to believe in preservation, we believe that there is a hand of God over everything, but we believe the words are inspired, not that the men are inspired. Okay, so when people were writing the words originally, they were moved by the Holy Spirit. Okay, so this is talking about the original documents. When John was writing down, they were moved by the Holy Spirit. When their pen hit the page, God was helping them and guiding them. So the words are inspired. The man is not inspired. That makes it out to be like a Pope sort of figure. You know, this inspiration thing is not some anointing thing that comes upon a man. It is, they are writing the words, and God is overseeing that. He is moving them by the Holy Spirit to pen those words. And so in the Old Testament, they used to, you know, they were prophesying and saying things, and things were getting written down. And so when we come through to preservation, the King James guys, they were just going through making decisions. And the way that they had set things up in their committees and everything like that, they were able to, through this cross-referencing, see, it's a bit like these guys would say that they're going to get a more accurate text through by using the CBGM. And you know, we're going to use computers, and computer says yes or no to, you know, to these readings. You either delete it or you add it or whatever. So they're praising the fact that we can use computers and this coherence-based genealogical method, and we can, you know, trace back the lineage of these manuscripts, and we would see a far more superior way of doing cross checks and balances would be for people for about 100 years. So from the time of the Complutensian Polyglot, and even before that, you know, they're going through Greek text, they're going through Latin text, and then a whole generation in Europe going through these things, looking at readings and saying, no, that reading doesn't make sense because of this, and that's a solecism, that's a grammatical error, that contradicts the Old Testament. And they're going through this, year after year, going through this, making translations from this. And see, the thing is, sometimes you don't realize it's an error until you're making translations, and then you're like, hang on, that translates in a very strange way. Let's just go back and we'll iron this out. Let's look at manuscript evidence. Let's look at all these things. Let's look at the Old Testament. Let's look, Then they get to the point where Beza's got it so narrow, so good. Then you've got 60 of the best linguists and scholars in Europe to basically go over all that work, and their cross-referencing methodology of translation makes it so it's gone through the sieve. In a sense, you get flour, you put it in the sieve, and you're shaking it. You're getting any imperfection out, and they only found like 20 in Beza's Textus Receptus, which is like almost nothing. And most of the time, these were issues that he brought up in his annotations anyway, and he's talked about these anyway. And so, these guys are making it like it's this huge big deal, and that's because Scrivener has made a 190 list, which seriously isn't that much anyway, but only 20 are translatable. So most of Scrivener's changes, and like I said, there's typos that he thinks should be part of the list, and it's like, well, Scrivener, you haven't read that right, so he's made mistakes. And when I go through his list in Matthew, which I've made videos on, if you want to go to my YouTube and just look up the Scrivener list, you can go through that and you can see there's absolutely nothing in Matthew that needed to be changed from the 1598. Nothing. I don't think there's anything there whatsoever. So probably one that I would go, okay, well, if you know more about this than I do in Matthew chapter 1, verse 23, where it talks about, the pluralization of, the Hebrew being you shall call or they shall call, I'm open to any correction or anything like that. But as far as I can tell, that has been pluralized for a reason. And, so I'll just let these guys continue.
Sometimes raise textual variance. He says, these notes show us, this is Hills, that the translators were guided providentially through their thought processes, through weighing every possibility and choosing that which seemed to them the best.
Notice, through weighing every possibility. So there's 100 years of, biblical, not skeptical, textual criticism done by, lots of different people, talking about these things, translating these things, going through it. They've gotten all the good scholars of the day, about 60 guys. They've overseen what's happened. They're able to go through a whole bunch of foreign language Bibles, go through all the TR editions. And see, the thing is, doesn't this contradict what Timothy Berg said before, that one of them had Stephanus and one of them had Erasmus and, all this sort of stuff, when now we're saying, okay, Scrivener is pointing out that, sometimes they went to Stephanus, sometimes they went to Erasmus. Wouldn't you think that they all had access to those things? Or else the other group would just say, oh, it's just a mistake. It doesn't match with our Stephanus, or it doesn't match with our Erasmus. You know what I'm saying? It's like they are refusing to acknowledge the cross-checking that the King James translators did. So let's just read through this. We'll read through it slowly. We'll get the gist of it, and then we'll let Timothy continue. But in the New Testament, 112 of the marginal notes give literal renderings of the Greek. And so, I'll just quickly throw one up here. What is it? Revelation chapter 13. Revelation 13, I think it's in verse 16. Revelation 13, verse 16. I'll just zoom down there. Yeah. Now I'll drag this over here. So this is on my website. Okay. So it has in the King James free and bond to receive a mark in their right hand, and then it has Greek to give, because the word receive and give are the same word. It just depends on the context. So if you are fluent in Greek, you know the context. It's like saying, hey, I'm doing a YouTube video, I'm going to go live. Most people wouldn't say, oh, he's going to go live. What, is he going to live his best life? Is he going to live? No, it's the same spelling and everything, but it means something different. And so this word isn't even a homophone or anything. It's exactly the same word, to give and to receive. It just has these two different meanings. And so in context, that formulates the difference. And so that's the type of marginal note with the cross there. That's just so someone who's looking through the Greek doesn't get confused and go, well, I wonder if the King James translators ever even considered this, and they're like, yeah, in the margin, we'll just put that there. So when they're going through that, these guys were teaching universities. In universities, they were teaching people Greek, so they knew where people were stumbling over these things, and they're putting their hand up saying, well, mine says that they're going to give the mark of the beast. It's like, yeah, I understand that. That's because the Greeks had this word that sort of meant both things, but in the context, you can tell what's happening. And so they would do a marginal note there. And so I just thought I'd show you that. So, yeah, they give literal renderings of the Greek. 582 give alternative translations, and 37 give variant readings. These marginal notes show us that the translators were guided providentially through their thought process, through weighing every possibility and choosing that which seemed best. So what Hills is saying is, okay, the King James translators have proven by even just their marginal notes that they went through all the editions of the TR, all the editions of the English Bibles. They went through any problem there was, like in original language understanding, and they weighed these things up, individually weighed them up, corporately weighed them up in their team, and then they sent it off to the other 5 teams who had to make judgments on it as well. So this type of cross-checking is it pushed the text to the point where it was the perfect text and the providentially guided text. And so if they had done this in a team in Switzerland, I would go, okay, well, the Swiss Bible is, that's the one you go to. All these scholars, they did this type of cross-checking. And so it's almost like, if you can get Erasmus, he can. They still mock him, and Stephanus and Beza. They still mock these guys as the Three Stooges, but at least they'll respect them, that what they've done in the Greek and what they've done with textual criticism is like, okay, that's worthy of commendation and praise, But when it comes to the King James translators, they're so used to these guys being made out to be bozos that they can't conceive in their mind that any single one of these 60 guys could have produced their own Greek text and it would have been accepted in Europe. You imagine if Lancelot Andrews turned around and said, okay, I've just done a Greek text, which that would have become the definitive text. I mean, who are the Elzevers? Do you know who they are? I don't really, because I sort of get to the King James, I'm like, okay, Elzevers just sort of copied from Stephanus, and they sort of added a few readings from Beza, and I'm sort of like, okay, that's fine, but that's after the fact sort of thing. My main interest is what the King James translators did. So if any one of them had produced a Greek text, it would have been accepted. They didn't do a parallel Greek Bible. They didn't do a parallel Hebrew Bible. Scrivener attempted to do the parallel Bible 250 years later. He's done an okay job. Most of the time it's okay because he's followed Beza. And if you just go through Beza's text and you can compare it to the King James, you can see there's only about 20 places in the whole entire New Testament where there is differences between his text and the King James. So
he's not denying that they were textual critics. He knows that they were. He's studied enough to know that they were making textual decisions. What separates us from Hills is simply that we don't claim that their textual decisions we're supernaturally, providentially guided by God, and he does.
A friend of mine.
Yeah, but you don't think any text is supernaturally and providentially guided by God. You think that it's just the manuscripts over in the corner that are guided by God, and 99% of them are majority text, so you throw them in the bin anyway. And you go with Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, which have massive disagreements, 3,000 disagreements just in the Gospels alone. So you guys are all over the place, and you think there was mistakes in the originals as well. And so Stephen Hayes says, I wish Mark Ward would quit insinuating that KJV defenders don't know Greek. Lots of us have been to seminary. We've had as much Greek as he has. Ruckman knew Greek. He had a PhD from Bob Jones. So, yeah, Ruckman knew Greek. And Bob Jones was more of a King James guy than probably D.A. Waite. You know what I mean? He was more of a Ruckmanite than, Waite. He was pushing for the King James to be read and to as the Word of God, So it's quite interesting when you listen to D.A. Waite talk about that, because he goes through a lot of the history of Ruckman. But yeah, it just seems so strange that even their lowest hanging fruit, which is like, Ruckman, he knew Greek probably way better than all these guys in this room put together. And so, Ruckman was no dummy. He knew his stuff. And when you read through his comments, he's like, okay, well, Thayers says this, and Little and Scott say this, and he's reading all this material that these guys are recommending you have to go to, that they're saying King James people don't go to these materials. So the lowest of the lowest hanging fruit that they're saying is the worst is way more educated than these guys. And so that's why I just think these guys just need to be honest about that, and they're just putting themselves on a pedestal because they don't agree with his position. And they're saying, well, we're better than him, when, in all honesty, I mean, I've met Jehovah's Witnesses who know their stuff, and you have to acknowledge that. If you're going to be an apologist, you have to say, okay, well, you obviously know your stuff, and I've had people quoting Hebrew to me and quoting Greek to me and all sorts of things, and it's like, wow, these people know their stuff. If you go to jw.org and you go through their articles, they're no dummies. They're coming to stupid conclusions, but they are not stupid people. They're not uneducated people, I should say. Stephen Hayes says, Stephen Anderson teaches Greek on the internet. He's been to Greece and speaks modern Greek fluently. Jeff Riddle is extremely capable in Greek. Same for Burgon, Hills, Letus, Waite. This is slander, absolutely. So you must be a little bit behind in the thing. But, yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned the same thing, but it's worth repeating, absolutely. And I mean, like I said, on the TR Academy, I could mention there's probably like 200 people on there who are way more qualified than these guys all put together. You know what I'm saying? It just, why are they saying this rubbish? And that's just on a Facebook group, let alone if I was to, really contact, because some people don't like Facebook. And so they're just not on there. But anyway.
Always says, did God's providence really stop in the 1611?
Yeah,
or does
exactly. And that's what it's like. How is that different from, say, the ESV Translation Committee,
right,
who are doing exactly the same thing?
The ESV Translation Committee are doing exactly the same thing. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly get that clip of them ESV. Okay. This is the ESV doing their work. Actually, I'll get copyrighted, so I won't put that up there. Yeah, they'll ban my video. I'm pretty sure they will. Actually, maybe I should just check that. Most of you have seen it. Okay, so just type in ESV translators slaves and you'll see that video, because I don't want to put it up there and then they ban my video. They do that like automatically. The bots just find it. So anyway,
they have a whole lot more evidence available to them. Mm-hmm. I don't think
the ESV guys have a whole lot more evidence available to them. Okay, so what was the reading? What was the manuscript that Theodore Beza had at Revelation chapter 16, the ancient manuscript that he had? Can you explain that to me? You have no idea. You didn't even know there was an ancient manuscript until, Jeff Riddle, myself, Larry Brigden, a bunch of guys have pointed that out, mostly Jeff Riddle, from the notes of Theodore Beza. You guys have no idea what that is. That for 200 years they've had no idea what that is, and it's taken a bunch of us illiterate King James only guys to just point that out. So you have no idea what Beza had. You have no idea what Erasmus had. And you're just guessing. And, if one of your mates writes a book on it, that becomes the authority. And so, James White was like, there's between 6 and 10 manuscripts that Erasmus used. And then he's come out and said, Erasmus probably had access to about 20 manuscripts. And, and then, people just keep parroting that whole thing of, Revelation. He only used one manuscript, which is a load of rubbish. Okay, so Ward... so this is Dustin. Hey, Dustin. Ward indeed implicates confessional bibliology as King James Version only, despite his half-hearted apology, even though being King James Version only in the English language is just a part of being confessional. Yeah, so what is wrong with being King James only? You know what I mean? What is wrong with saying, okay, in English, this is our text? There's nothing wrong with that. He makes out that that's a cultic position. So these guys have gone to their universities. They've learned, okay, Jehovah's Witness, wrong. Let's study that. Okay, Mormons, wrong. Let's study that. Okay, King James onlyist, cultic. Let's study that. So they've just been told this, and they come out with this mindset going, bzzz, King James, King James, King James. And then whenever they see it, they're just like, you're King James only. And let's do videos on this, and let's talk about this. And it's like, it's just not reality. I mean, there's nothing wrong with the King James. The King James is awesome. It's great, and I'm glad we have it. And the King James is two things. It's a great translation, but it is also the final edition, the underlying Greek text and the underlying Hebrew text of the King James, and the decisions that they made is the final edition of the Textus Receptus and Hebrew Masoretic text. So it's a pinnacle. The, Complutensian guys, Erasmus, Stephanus, Beza, they worked to a goal, and that was completed in 1611. And then since then, there's just been a regression down to Westcott and Hort and the rubbish that they have today. And so that's why we consider the King James. We don't consider the King James as just awesome because it's just an English text and we're English people. Like I said earlier, if it had been done in German or Switzerland or some other place, we would go, okay, that's the definitive text because they've figured out all the words. That's where all the words are. And so that's why the Bible Society recognizes this, and they used the Textus Receptus, the Masoretic text, and they were guided by the King James translation. Westcott and Hort knew this. The guys who worked for Ellicott, the revision committee, they commissioned Scrivener to create this 250 years after the King James, and he was to do this because they saw that this was the underlying Greek text that had just never gotten around to being printed.
They always get it right any more than I think the King James. Sure, they're learned men.
Hang on, they get it right more than the King James. Okay, so I just want to focus it because he talks very fast, but sometimes if you just break it up, he can sort of see. He might say 5 things, and there can be 5 things wrong here. So let's just let him continue.
From say the ESV translation committee, right, who are doing exactly the same thing.
They're not doing exactly the same thing.
They have a whole lot more evidence available.
They don't have a whole lot more evidence. A lot of the time, they've regressed in their knowledge, and they've bound themselves to strange readings like monogenes means unique or one of a kind instead of only begotten.
Available to them. Mm-hmm. I don't think they always get it right any more than I think the King James. Sure, they're
okay. So he's admitting they don't get it right. The King James guys get it wrong. They get it wrong. So. Because you can't be sure. You don't want to be a cultist and say that the ESV guys got it right. They can't nail anything right. If you were to get the book of 2 John, nice tiny little book, I think it's got 13 verses. If you were to spend your whole life on that, go through it, ironing out every problem, and brought it to the table, it's still if you can't say that that's accurate or that that's the word of God, or else you're an absolutist. You have to say, well, it's probably filled with mistakes. You know what I mean? When can you get to the point where something's accurate?
There are learned men, some of the learned men of our age and some of the learned men of their age. There are certainly, things you could, if you wanted, to nitpick, you could find some serious errors on the part of some of the King James translators, as I'm sure.
If you wanted to nitpick, you can find some serious errors on the part of the King James translators. It's like, well, I mean, they're human, And what's amazing when you read, say, like James Price, he worked on the New King James. He would say things like, I would rather believe that we have the Bible today in the Nestle Aland, it was 27th edition, I think he was talking about, rather than believe that a group of infallible men came up with the text. And so they have this thing like, King James people believe that the King James translators were infallible. No, they just worked hard. They worked hard and came up with the text just as God had promised in his preservation. And this is the thing, these guys have basically said they've rejected preservation. Then they've come up with this sort of rehashed model of preservation. But even Elijah, up until the Myths and Mistake book came out, or just after it came out, he didn't believe in preservation. And so these guys are not getting their doctrine from the Bible. The Bible clearly talks about preservation. They're getting it from man. They're getting it from their universities, their colleges, their seminaries. They're getting it from each other. Someone will write, one of their friends will write a book on preservation. They'll go, oh, I'll believe that, rather than, I was reading through the Bible and this verse clearly says to all generations, it says to your sons, sons, and from this generation forth and forever. And it's like, that's preservation, and so that they actually actively come against verses that talk about preservation, and they reinterpret them.
You could, the ESV or the NAV or any other major Bible committee, but whatever.
And what did he say? The ESV.
Wanted, to nitpick, you could find some serious errors on the part of some of the King James translators, as I'm sure you could. The ESV or the NAV or any other major Bible.
ESV, NAV, New American Version, I guess, NAV. But maybe he said NIV, but it's like NAV, So this is one of the things, because you have Virginia Mollencott, who was, worked for the NIV, and she came out, and she's still today, her lesbian partner they're both like leaders of the church, and so they're married and everything. And, this was a big thing. People were saying, well, why have you got, lesbians working on the NIV? And so she had a, questionable testimony before the NIV. She worked on the NIV, and then afterwards she came out and was like, I'm a lesbian. And people have pointed out that the NIV will change things, like say sodomites has changed into shrine prostitutes, and it's like just a redefinition of terms. And so we can see that type of thing with Jennifer Knust. Jennifer Knust is one of the leading people behind the New Revised Standard Version, and she basically, if you were to interview her and say, do you believe the Bible is from God, she'd say, oh, absolutely not. The Bible is just full of myths, and it's to support the patriarchy. And I'd say, do you think the Bible comes against certain sexual lifestyles that of the alphabet soup community? And she'd say, absolutely not. The Bible doesn't even talk about those things. It's like, so these are leaders in, these people hang around. Tommy Wasserman wrote a book with this girl, so these guys love Tommy Wasserman. And so this is the thing, these guys, if you just open the door behind them, here's Jennifer Knust and Tommy Wasserman, they're just being absolutely like, tier level number 10 liberals, but they won't even talk about them. They'd rather talk about you and me being like Ruckman, or Catholics or whatever. So Stephen Hayes says, this is nothing more than academic gatekeeping, and analogous to the priesthood in Roman Catholicism. It's the appeal to authority fallacy, but these guys commit logical fallacies left and right. Yeah, all over the place. And so yeah, I won't try and repeat that word. As you can see, I'm sort of rolled out of bed and doing this video, so I won't embarrass myself with trying to repeat that word over and over. I need another coffee.
Bible committee. You know, but whatever that is, like, how is that different?
Right.
And the only way it becomes different is if the Spirit was at work in 1611 in a way that he isn't today.
Well,
no. So if the Jehovah's Witnesses worked on their text and they came up with a poor text, that's just because they're Jehovah's Witnesses. They're using the wrong text, they're using wrong methodology, and they're simply not genuine in their goals. See, the King James translators believed that they were dealing with the words of God. And so I might even see if I can... King James... Okay, so I'll just jump in here because I'm pretty sure that what he just mentioned was talked about in this article. Because I went through this and I played the audio quite a few times, and there was a few things that they mentioned where they saw, you know, the original sacred tongues. Maybe it's actually in the translators to the reader rather than in this, but it talks about, you know, the two golden pipes and the originals. Yeah, that's it. It's in the translators to the reader. So the reader, sorry about my rabbit trailing here, but I just want to, it's an opportunity to talk about this. Okay, so is that in one article? No, so I can't. Oh yeah, search it. There we go. So golden pipes. Oh, golden pig. Why? Okay, yeah, let's search for that. Here we go. I'll just start from here. I'm not sure if that's the correct spot, but it says, "Oh, let thy scriptures be my pure delight, and let me not be deceived in them, neither let me deceive by them. In this confidence and with this devotion did they assemble together, not too many, lest one should trouble another, and yet many, lest many things haply might escape them. If you ask what they had before them, truly it was the Hebrew text, not just the Bodleian, 1602 of the Old Testament, and the Greek of the New." Okay. "These are the two golden pipes, or rather conduits, where through the olive branches empty themselves into the gold. St. Augustine calleth them precedent or original tongues. St. Jerome, fountains. The same St. Jerome affirmeth, and Gratian hath not spared it to put it into his decree, that as the credit of the old books, he meaneth the Old Testament, is to be tried by the Hebrew volumes, so of the New Testament by the Greek tongue, he meaneth by the original Greek. If the truth be to be tried by these tongues, then whence should translation made but out of them? These tongues, therefore, the scriptures, we say in those tongues, we set before us to translate." So they translated from the original tongues, being the tongues wherein God was pleased to speak to his church by his prophets and apostles. And so then it's saying, we didn't care, to go over them. Like, if it's reported to be true, what the guys of the Septuagint did, we sort of we didn't limit ourselves to 72 days. We went over and over it for 7 years, So anyway, but I just wanted to read that. So they went to the original Greek and they went to the original Hebrew, what they considered the original Greek and the original Hebrew. Okay, so it's very important.
Let me represent our opponents, and on this, they are our.
Now, I just want to finish that thought, so let's let Peter continue.
The ESV or the NAV or any other major Bible committee, but whatever that is, like, how is that different?
Right.
And the only way it becomes different is if the Spirit was at work in 1611 in a way that he isn't today.
No, they've got the wrong text today. So even if you were to translate the Nestle Island United Bible Society text perfectly, you would still have the wrong text. And so you'd still have geographical errors, historical errors, contradictions. You'd have a whole bunch of problems in that. So they're not doing the same work. If they were going over the Textus Receptus, Masoretic text, and then they're doing the same work as the King James translators, but they're not. And they're also failing to acknowledge it's not just a translation, it's a compilation of all the Hebrew and Greek words into one place, into the English language.
Well, let me represent our opponents.
So you imagine if the Nestle Island group basically all got together and they brought out the 29th edition, but it was just an English text. You know what I mean? So that's sort of what the King James guys did with the TR. They could have done a parallel, but they didn't do that.
And on this, they are our opponents. They're our brothers, but they're our opponents. This is what I'm pretty sure it was R.B. Willett said. I was trying to find the quote while we were talking. Pretty sure it was him. Sorry if I'm wrong. He said that the difference is the King James translators, and I believe he includes people like Erasmus and Stephanus and Beza here, were doing this work in the context of faith in preservation of God's words. So the way our textual absolutist friends in the King James only world tend to talk about this is until Westcott and Hort came along in the 18th.
So you notice the absolutist friends in the King James only world, just these little statements. You're an absolutist now, but they've got this term so they don't call you King James only, but you're an absolutist and you live in the King James only world. It's like the flat earthers who live in conspiracy land, and it's just, he's just constantly, he can't stop himself. I believe this is a sign that he doesn't have the Holy Spirit. He can't control himself. He just has to slander. At every opportunity, he's just slandering. Just, oh, you're like this person. Or you're ridiculous. You're uneducated. You don't know the language. It's just constant belittling. And I think he's actually, what's happened, he's set himself up as this guru. He doesn't have the bullets to handle this. Like, I mean, you wouldn't even consider him like, even a scholar like, say, Dean John William Burgon, you wouldn't even consider Mark Ward to be 5% of a man like that. But he stood in front of this train of King James onlyism, being smashed by it. I mean, I've had, the Ruckmanites come after me and been really full on, and it's like, man, these guys are intense, So he's jumped in the middle of this battle and gotten smashed, and now he's bitter. And at any opportunity, he's just like, these King James only guys, and you can sort of see him seething there. He's the bitterness is coming out of his mouth. You can tell. The Bible says, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. He is just constantly saying untrue things, slandering. And Timothy Berg's even pulled him up and said, dude, if you're going to try and reach these people, you've got to stop labeling, Jeff Riddle as a King James onlyist, or these other people as King James only. They're not. And he's like, okay, but they're textual absolutists in King James only land, It's like, you imagine Timothy Berg sitting there going, I thought we talked about this, but he can't help himself.
1980s, and again, we'll get there. Everybody believed in the preservation of God's words, and so anything they were doing can't even properly be called textual criticism. How would you guys respond to that?
Well, just as an illustration, where I work CSNTM, we're putting on a conference this week, and I was sitting with one of my coworkers who is from outside the area of textual criticism. He's one of my newer coworkers, so he's still getting the hang of who all the people are. And I was in his office just yesterday, and he sat down and he said, so most of these are unbelievers, right? Like, that's what I've come to understand, is most of these text critics are unbelievers. And I was looking through the list with him. I said, well, he's a very conservative evangelical. That guy, I'm convinced.
Who? Tommy Wasserman or Jennifer Knust, or whose list are you looking at? It'd be interesting, actually. Maybe I should have a look at who went to the CSNTM conference. Let's have a quick look. I mightn't recognize anyone, but I'm sure there's a list of names here. Okay, conference, csntm.org. Let's have a quick look. Jan Kranz. Oh. See, the thing about Jan Kranz, I mean, him and Bart Ehrman are great mates, you know. Yeah, they're conservatives, you know. So I don't know. I know Dirk Jonken, but at the end of the day, these guys, they have association with Bart Ehrman. They have association with liberals in the academy. And so I don't know who these other guys are. So it's like, okay, well. So I wonder who else was there. So someone's like, so these guys are all Christians, like Jan Kranz, you know. The things that he said over the years are just, you know, I just simply would say that he is just completely liberal. You know, him and, you know, someone like Tommy Wasserman, if he was on the list here, you know. But he's part of the, you know, the ETC blog. This is, you know, where, you know, Elijah's part of this blog and all the rest of it. So let's look at the people who are contributing here. You know, Peter Head, Tommy Wasserman. So he's a main editor here, so he doesn't believe in hell. He sort of mocks, you know, the whole concept of conservatism in the United States. He's very liberal, and he's the one who's hanging around Jennifer Knust, who doesn't, you know, believe in the Bible, and you know, supports the LGBT community and will preach in their churches and say homosexuality is not a sin. It's not even mentioned in the Bible, apparently. And so, yeah, so who are these people? Why are they hanging around each other? You know, Peter Gurry, he talks about the Bible that we hold in our hands is full of apocryphal readings. And so, you know, they've got this list of people, the who's who. Elijah Hixson's there. But yeah, we can see, sure, you might get some conservative guys, you know, Michael Bird. I mean, he's an Aussie guy. I sort of follow what he says because he's an Australian. And I sort of get the feeling that one day we'll probably debate each other. Just this strange feeling. So I follow what he says, and he's debated Bart Ehrman, but he's quite liberal if you follow him on Twitter. But yeah, Wasserman doesn't believe in a literal hell. So, but yeah, his association with Jennifer Knust would definitely come against the whole thing of biblical separation. I mean, she's definitely not even close to being saved or anything, not even close to being called a roundabout Christian or just a liberal Christian or anything. She's just absolutely like a Bart Ehrman. And the thing is, these guys, they all will, you know, Tommy Wasserman. If I just typed in Tommy Wasserman, Bart Ehrman, Tommy Wasserman, Bart Ehrman, images. Well, there's Jennifer Knust. There's Tommy Wasserman, Maurice Robinson. I mean, you don't have these guys turning around and saying to her that you're a heretic, you need to repent. But if Peter Ruckman was there, they'd all be up in arms, like, how dare they have this horrible guy there, you know, sort of thing. But there is a lot of pictures of Wasserman and Ehrman together, but it doesn't seem to be Google searchable. So, anyway, I'll drop that topic and we'll just move on.
Convinced as a brother in Christ, he's Anglican, but I'm convinced that he's my brother in Christ. I know him well enough for that. And I at the end of the day, there were just a small percentage of the whole thing where I didn't know if they were Christians or not. And he just kind of sat back in his seat and he said, "You mean most of these people are Christians?" And I said, yeah. I know most of them. I've had at least one of them come preach at my church before,
So I wonder if Elijah Hixson would consider Tommy Wasserman a Christian, or Jennifer Gnust, or half of these people who have questionable credentials in the academy. So he's obviously saying Jan Kranz is a Christian. So what's amazing is say Grantley MacDonald, who's written the book against 1 John 5:7. He has been sponsored by, say Hank de Jong and other people to write this book. And he's a smart guy. He knows his stuff. He's from the same city I'm from in Melbourne, Victoria. He's well educated in Latin and he knows his stuff. But he's obviously a contra. And so, when I read his stuff, to me, it's like a Jehovah's Witness has written it. But he basically says that all types of fundamentalism, including Christian fundamentalism, is dangerous. And he likens religious fanatics like King James only type of people to be like the Taliban. And so he's just an atheist, basically. This guy's an absolute atheist, doesn't believe in God, doesn't believe in anything. But he's the go-to guy for 1 John 5:7. So if you were to talk to these guys and say, I'm starting to believe it's genuine, I'm starting to become an absolutist, what do I do? They'd say, I'll read this book by this guy. He's an atheist and he'll help you. Okay, I'm starting to think that the Prickabay Adultera is genuine. What do I do? Tommy Wasserman, he doesn't believe in hell. He's a liberal, to the back teeth. And he's co-written this book with this woman who is the main person in the LBGT community, who just happens to be a Bible translator for the chief editor for the New Revised Standard Version that's just come out. And so why aren't they looking at these people and doing critiques on them? So I know that Mark Ward. So I've been saying this for about 6 months, and I noticed since I've been saying it, Mark Ward did a thing on homosexuality and the New Revised Standard Version. I think he's like, there's issues in our own camp. Yeah, just open the door behind you, Mark, and have a look. You'll see 100 people who you can easily critique, who make people like Ripplinger, Peter Ruckman, and the people who you see as the lowest hanging fruit, they make these guys look like angels. And so...
story I heard in King James Onlyism when I was there is that all textual criticism is evil and all textual critics are out there to criticize the Bible. Who would do that except an unbeliever?
And when I was, I've got this personal story. I heard this once from someone, all textual criticism is evil. Well, if you're doing it wrong, isn't all Jehovah's Witness textual criticism evil? Isn't all their translation methodology wrong? And so we're just looking at Westcott and Hort and with their association with Unitarians like George Van Smith and others, and we're just like, well, this is wrong what they've done. They've amalgamated Vaticanus and Sinaiticus together. This Frankenstein monster, we don't believe in it. We think it's rubbish. And so their methodology is wrong. And it was proven wrong not long after when they found the papyri and they found the Byzantine readings in the papyri. People had to admit, well, the Byzantine text was obviously around before 400. And so, which was what Dean Burgon was pointing out. And that they were proven wrong. The Lucianic recension, that was their main, Trojan horse, has proven to be a complete lie. It's a complete myth. And so no one believes that anymore. They used to believe it was the main thing that people believed, that that the true texts, like Vaticanus, Sinaiticus type manuscripts, were destroyed by Lucian, and then they promoted the the Byzantine type texts. So it was sort of like this usurping of the word of God for this horrible Byzantine text, you know. And it's just turned out to be a myth. I know I might have got some of the details wrong, and I'm sort of summarizing it in a certain way, but that's pretty much what they believed and thought.
And the story, you know, that I was told was that, you know, so I mean, at least, and this is, you know, where some of the positions get a little muddy, you know, that yes, theoretically the Bible could be retranslated today, and that would even be an admirable thing, but there aren't enough honest Bible scholars alive today to translate the Bible. And yet we actually have, it's, you know,
it's because they're not of the same caliber as the King James Version translators. And so
the type of learning that we have today, learning Latin and Greek at very young ages, is less common. But we're blessed with an abundance of brilliant scholars who are, you know, you think of someone like Dirk Youngkind, who we mentioned his book, or Pete Williams. We'll get to his book in a little bit. You know, Pete's on the ESV translation committee.
It's one of the most brilliant people I've ever met.
He's in.
The ESV translation committee, sponsored by the World Council of Churches. You can't forget that. You know, let's just have a quick look at because they're talking about ESV. So you know, you can get your Catholic ESV edition, the Catholic edition, you know, because they've got this huge audience there. I'll just bring that back to here. Da-da-da. Okay, well, I'm sort of rabbit trailing, and so, okay, let's have a quick look at this. The ESV and the RSV and the National Council of Churches, a question came to mind stemming from the response to a recent post regarding the license Crossway gave for the Roman Catholic Church version of the ESV. Does it concern anyone that the ESV was created from and remains 94% the same as the RSV, which was licensed by the World Council of Churches? Modern translation history is not my speciality. I'm not King James Version only, and I know many here know much more than me. So that's one of the problems, and this is pointed out by Theodore Letus. This, you know, so there are two possible areas of concern. First has to do with money, the second with the translation itself. First, with regard to money, there was a long concern that the National Council of Churches benefited greatly from the selling of the license of the RSV to Crossway. I am still not sure how to feel about this. I understand the concern. However, from my understanding, it was a lump sum, and so the NCC is not receiving royalties from ESV. Second, in regard to translation, there is also concern about the ESV being based on the RSV. So the RSV was a terrible translation. This is a translation with recognized liberal tendencies, not only in certain renderings, but even the handling of the ancient texts and variants. However, to say the ESV is therefore somehow tainted is a genetic fallacy, and so he goes on to that. But this is, you know, obviously these guys aren't King James only or whatever, but they're concerned about the, you know, the influence of the World Council of Churches, the influence of a Bible that was pretty much, I mean, even James White said he came against, when you listen to his interview with Gail Ripplinger on the radio station, he has like this 4-part series about Gail Ripplinger. It's pretty old. It's in the 90s. But he said that he came out against Bible perversions. So he calls the RSV a Bible perversion, but he stops using that language after that audio. And so he considered that a perversion. He said that NIV is a liberal Bible. He said that to Stephen Anderson. Not really sure what started Mark Ward on his goal to convert all KJV churches to non-KJV churches. I think he started getting money from Lexham, and that they were like, well, we want you to go out and we want you to convert people to a position where they want, not just one Bible, because that's wrong. You're an absolutist. You need 20 Bibles, then you're a good guy. And, who's going to profit from that? Logos.
Incredibly brilliant. And his love for the Word of God is, I would definitely match like Pete and Dirk up to the King James Translation Committee.
Oh, my God. I mean, it just amazes me, that these guys, that they're making these type of comparisons. I don't think there's anyone in Munster, anyone in Tyndale House who would match up to the King James translators. I mean, even the smallest guys, you read through what they've done, and it's like, man, these guys knew their stuff. They knew, they weren't just like this. You look at the ESV translation committee, and it's filled with liberal people. It's you look at their MEV, they were in joint cooperation with the Roman Catholics, and they had Orthodox people work with them as well. And so, I mean, these guys wouldn't be able to sit in the same room with the King James translators. They would just be mocked. But the guys who they consider their gurus, I just can't, and the thing is, I know some people might just be looking at me saying, well, you just got a bias because you got King James. I've read the biographies of these guys. Maybe I can just bring that website up again. King James translators. So let's just do a random. Okay, let's just do a random here. Second Cambridge, Andrew Downes. Okay. His life was devoted to scholarship, especially Greek, and he was described as the Alblest Grecian of Christendom. Like, can you imagine one of these guys, like, who they're praising, being, described as the king of Greek in Christianity? I mean, these guys, they knew Greek like, someone like Georgios Babiniotis, they were writing dictionaries and things like that. Okay, so from the 12th century, Okay, so he went on to university studies at Cambridge when he was just 14 and spent the entire balance of his life there as a scholar and a professor. He was a bachelor until he was 55 years old. So he got married at 55. Wow. So he was just single and just devoted his life to scholarship. And so this is from a diary. When I came to his house near the public schools, he sent for me up into a chamber where I found him sitting in a chair with his legs upon a table that stood by him. He neither stirred his hat or body, but only took me by the hand and instantly fell into discourse. After a word or two, of course, had passed between us, touching matters of learning and criticism, he was of personage big and tall. Okay, so it doesn't really say much about his scholarship in that comment. Here we go. Education. This is what I'm looking for. Andrew Downes became a student at Shrewsbury School, only a few miles from his home at Morton Corbett. Okay, so it says, among all the letters of his life, his one happiness had come to him that he had none greater, that his father placed him when he was a boy under the care of most excellent man. So he was guided by a guy called Ashton. So he was elected Regius Professor of Greek at Cambridge. I mean, to be a Cambridge Regius Professor, you have to know your stuff. And I'm just looking for some more tidbits here. Don't want to go too long with this. His scholastic reputation grew with his advancing years. His influence on rising generations of scholars was great. John Boyce, Downes's protege and a fellow translator, said he was much bound to bless God for him. So he had influence on John Boyce, who none of us would say was any slouch, probably one of the greatest linguists, the greatest scholars ever. Okay, so Downes and John Boyce assisted Sir Henry Saville, a fellow translator, on the works of Chrysostom. So he worked on Chrysostom as well. Early church father. Okay, so he retired in 1526. Okay, Okay, so but I think you get the idea. This guy, I don't think I could read of anyone living today who is in Munster or who works for Tyndale House or who's working on the Nestle Island text, who has this type of credentials. And I don't think you would be able to get anyone who has this. See, when they're talking about, they knew Greek today, half the time, I might even just get this clip. So this is someone who's in the academy. Okay, so sorry I'm doing a little bit of jumping around today, but I'm trying to really get to the bottom of a lot of this stuff. Bart Ehrman, okay. Now, there was a video going around that was like only a minute long that had Bart Ehrman talking about the King James translators, saying how superior they are to people in the academy today. And so here's someone in the academy saying this. So I just want to quickly see if I can grab it. If not, we'll just have to move on. But okay, so I'm pretty sure maybe it's this one. Yeah, because it was recent.
Hi, thanks for tuning in today. Today I wanted to share a clip with you from Dr. Bart Ehrman, and it really is a challenge to us in some ways. Dr. Bart Ehrman is a well-known biblical scholar. He studied in Princeton under Dr. Bruce Metzger. He's well known in circles of textual criticism and things of that nature. He's also known as a critic of Christianity. He was himself at one time a believer. He'd gone through Moody Bible Institute. He ended up losing his faith. And I think he's done quite a bit of damage, quite frankly, to conservative Christians in terms of how he's attacked conservative Christianity, his attacks on the Bible. I don't think he's done any good work in that regard. I don't question his erudition or intelligence, but what caught my attention was he did this lecture.
Okay, so I think it's here. Sorry to bore you with that.
Maybe it was more of an
but what he's saying is good. This guy's actually pretty good. I would subscribe to this, Biblical Studies and Reviews.
Writing Greek grammars that were present in his lecture, and he gave out a test, and he had them translate. He gave them an English word and said, translate
okay,
this
so
into Greek.
I'm trying to find the clip and I can't find it. So I would just say to you, go to KJV, an atheist Bible scholar studying admission, Bart Ehrman. Well, Bart Ehrman basically says the people in the academy don't really know Greek. They just use dictionaries. And so they're not as superior as the King James translators. And so he makes this admission. And then at the end of this video, they've got there was a guy who basically came out and had a list of words, and he was like, can you guys translate these words? And so and they couldn't. People just didn't know Greek. They could, they knew the alphabet, they could read, pronounce the words, but they didn't really know what they meant. And so we're looking at, very basic level Greek, where they're saying that they're experts in Greek. It's like James White. If you listen to him, he just sort of sounds like Google Translate, and he doesn't really, he's not fluent. But he's claiming that he's a Greek scholar. So it's a bit like if we might look at someone, say, who knows broken English, and say they're from India. They say, yes, I speak English. I know the words. I can speak, you would be like, hang on, are you fluent? Can you speak these things absolutely fluently? And so do you know everything about this language? And, oh, yes, I know, and so we would sort of mock that, and coming from a Western society, if someone came knocking at your door wanting to teach your kids and they couldn't speak English properly themselves, that they were an English scholar, So, James White calls himself a Greek scholar. And many times they're just teaching basics. They're teaching alphabet, and they're teaching, they might read through, John, 1 John. And so, okay, 135. Thank you very much. That is awesome. So one.
Questions among scholars about how many people actually participated in the translation, but the best guess is that there were 47 translators who were all skilled, highly skilled in a Greek and Hebrew. Today, when somebody's highly skilled in Greek, like Jeff Snyder and me, we're considered highly skilled in Greek. That means we can kind of slosh our way through a Greek text if we have a good dictionary sitting next to us. These guys, including King James, could speak Greek, and did speak Greek to each other when they felt like it. And they could read Hebrew like the newspaper. So, I mean, these were serious scholars who, their excuse is they didn't have TV. There was no ESPN. What did they do? They sit around and study Greek. This is what they did. And so they were at Latin and Hebrew and what.
I thought this was very interesting. And it sort of is an indictment on current biblical scholarship. It used to be that biblical scholars had a much wider, broader.
So I'd encourage you to watch that video, but thanks for showing me where that clip is. That was very helpful. I'll just go back. So that's what I was looking for. Yeah. So let's let Peter continue.
And say, absolutely, I'd be.
Story about Pete. Pete, when I worked for Dirk worked for Pete. So Pete was my grand boss, and I think that was the word one of them used. How some people have, if they come from immigrant families, you might retain your native language and speak it at home, even if you speak a different language out in public. I was at a Christmas dinner with Pete Williams one day, and the language that he and his daughter were speaking back and forth, teenage daughter, I believe, Hittite. They were talking in Hittite to each other. And I kind of turned to my wife and I said, I didn't know that was a language. I thought that was just some people in the Old Testament. Like, that's not only is it a language, but he's talking to his daughter in it.
Yeah, we've all heard, and I
mean, it's this anecdotal story. I mean, yeah, I've talked to some of my relatives. I've taught them Greek, and around people, I'm like, what's this Greek word and what's this Greek letter, and they're little kids and they know it, and it doesn't mean there's a level of fluency. It's just an anecdotal story, sort of like you get this picture, like, well, they fluently speak this at home. They're just like, pass the potatoes, and they're like, and they're saying it in this language, sort of thing, where it might have just been, they might know 10 words. It's hard to know with an anecdotal story like that. Okay, so I'll just grab this. Image bearer said, apparently the clip is from a lecture by Ehrman that can be found on YouTube titled Manifold Greatness, King James Bible. Okay, yeah, so I think I've gone through that, and this is one of the things that shows me that Bart Ehrman really doesn't know much about the King James Bible. And so these guys would know way more about the King James Bible than Bart Ehrman does. I don't really respect Bart Ehrman's scholarship that much. He just tends to say the consensus says this, and so then if he's wrong, he's like, oh, well, consensus has changed, you know.
The Trinitarian Bible Society put this in the quarterly record. Yes, theoretically it would be possible for us to revise the King James Version, but we doubt that men of sufficient knowledge and godliness exist who could do this work. Of course,
Okay, so it says here, in principle, the Society is not opposed to there being a revision of the AV, but it would need to be done at a time when there is a greater level of consensus in the English-speaking Christian world, and at a conjuncture when revival has added to the church men with godliness, wisdom, and language skills to undertake a fifth official revision of this venerable Bible. Until that day, the Society would not be adding to the plethora of Bible editions, which all claim to be the neutral successor to the AV, and yet which have all signally failed that endeavor. So I think that's a really good point. They're just saying, if we are going to hire Bible translators to do this, they've all got a bias. They've, you know, if we're going to do this type of thing, you need people who, there needs to be a revival of, you know, TR, you know, Masoretic text support, and you know, people gifted in language skills to undertake such a thing. And see, I think to me, to update English words isn't that hard. I mean, we do it on the fly when we're talking to someone who mightn't understand the King James. You know, when I'm preaching in Papua New Guinea, and you know, I don't just say verbatim, you know, King James. I'll, you know, word it on the fly. And so that's why I've done the 2016 edition, so that I can just read reams of scripture. And also when I'm doing translation work from English into you know, Khmer or English into Urdu, we don't have to deal with you know, the morphology being a little bit outdated, or archaic terms. They're already just updated there, so we can easily have access to a running text that the person whose language, usually English is their third language, they can easily go through that without having those type of problems. And so I think it's not that difficult. And so, but I know that I talked to the Trinitarian Bible Society probably about 15 years ago, and I said, well, what about an update? And they said, definitely, we are not interested in doing an update. And I think they actually said to me that they were bound by their constitution, that they couldn't do an update. So I guess the people there could sort of break away from the, you know, TBS and do it. But I'm pretty sure the TBS is bound to only have the authorized version. So they're sort of bound by that. So I talked to D.A. Wade about the whole thing about, you know, updating, and he said, you know, there's just not people available to do that. And so, yeah, that's an opinion.
I'm wondering a couple things. Is that true for all of their Bible translation projects? Do they insist that the people working on the Persian translation project actually asked a man?
And so that's actually a good point that Mark Ward brings out, because when you go through the Trinitarian Bible Society, and they're in contact with me at the moment over the Urdu Bible that we're doing, and so I wouldn't be considered, you know, the guru guy to go to update the English, but apparently I can do a good enough job with the Urdu. And so I guess the thing is, people just want Bibles in every language. That we want it in Chinese, we want it in Japanese, we want it in Urdu, we want them in Khmer, and they're sort of like, okay, well, it's better than what's on the market. It's better than the critical text Bible. But there is a good point there where sometimes, the King James translators, they were so good But the thing is, they have actually done a whole bunch of homework to give us the tools that we need so that we can continue on the work that the Bible Societies did. So the Bible Society, when it started off, they were to use the Textus Receptus, the Masoretic text, and they were to be guided by the King James translation, which is exactly what I'm doing. And so I actually used their earlier editions of the Matthew Henry's Urdu text, the Hindustani Bible, and we're going through these and using these as like a draft, like a bit like the Bishop's Bible sort of thing, that we're using these as a platform to then make it as close to the King James as possible, as close to the Textus Receptus and Masoretic text as possible. And so recognizing that they're basically the same thing. And so this work has been done by many people, and there are many accurate Bibles around the world that are usually a little bit older, because the Bible Society has stopped doing this. They've introduced the Westcott and Hort or Nestle Allen text. And so, but yeah, it is a good point. When does it get to the stage where, the Persian Bibles come out? We know, I think it's Punnam. I can't remember his name exactly, but he lives in the UK. And, does he have that education level of the King James translators? I would say no. But is he capable of putting that into the Persian language? I would say yes. And so this is where it comes to the stage where I believe the ability of the King James translators to be who they are, that is why we have all the words of God there correct. Now, we do have also an amazing translation, and, that's because they were so skilled in their languages and in English. But when it comes to a foreign language, I mean, if we could create something like that's equivalent to sort of like a New King James in every language, we would be like, okay, that's way better than the garbage that they're bringing out today. I mean, the Bible Societies are so bad when it comes to foreign languages. I mean, even in New Guinea, they couldn't describe the lamb because instead of having a footnote describing what a lamb is, let's talk about something that they know about. So we'll call Jesus the guinea pig of God instead of a lamb of God. They describe the lamb as a guinea pig. So Jesus is the guinea pig of God. In the Alaskan Bible, it talks about the seal of God, because it's this white fluffy baby seal. It's pure. It's like, guys, stop doing this. This is terrible. So that's why people like the Trinitarian Bible Society, like, we just, any Bible that's a TR Bible, we want to promote that. But obviously they want to have these guided. And the Spanish Bible has been quite interesting because lots of people have worked on that. D.A. Waite and the Gomez Bible has been quite big, but they've said that it's based on Ruckmanism and all that. And so the TBS have done another edition of the Spanish Bible. And so anyway, I'm sort of diverting, but he did bring up the TBS and he did bring up the scholarship of today. And so, but I think it's quite easy to actually get the King James and to put that into a foreign language. And so that's what I would do. William Carey had translated about 40 different language Bibles. And so what he did, he had a principle that he would do a starter Bible. So he mightn't have known the languages fluently, but he knew people who did. So he would get them to translate certain things, just say like the Gospel of John for starters, or the Gospel of Mark, or just a couple of letters. And then from there, people would grow. And so he might have just started it and had moved on to something else, but at least he's heading in the right direction. And so that's where I see that I want to go with, especially with the Urdu, especially with the Khmer Bible that we've done the New and Old Testament in the Cambodian language in. And there's many other Bibles that have been done, and we want to make parallel Bibles, but we don't want to just stop there. We want to get them to the standard where they're at the standard of the King James. And so the Persian Bible, yes, that's great, but we want to constantly go over it and over and over it until it's at the standard of the King James. And I'm sure that the translators, the Trinitarian guys, and I'm pretty sure his name is Punam from Iran, who's living in England, I'm sure that he would appreciate, people pointing out, hey, this can be translated better. And I'm sure if he was able to replicate exactly what they did in 1611 with committees and people looking at that. So you've got to have it started, like a Tyndale starter edition, and go through that. And now sometimes the work's already been done, and you're just updating words. And so I'm pretty sure that's what he is doing as well. So a lot of the time you've already had people who, a committee who's worked on something like that. So if we look at, the Staten Vertaling Bible that was done in Dutch, we see that they didn't use as many translators, and but they still did a work that is equivalent to the King James, because the King James just nailed where all the words are. They created the final edition of the TR, the final edition of the Masoretic text, and now people have that ability to just go into the English and translate that over into their language, and all they have to do is just pretty much tidy that up, and they've got the Greek and Hebrew equivalent. And so, amen to the quote of the TBS. So that's by Image Bearer. So let's just continue.
Who's working on that project? He didn't answer recently, hasn't answered yet. Did they all start learning Hebrew and Greek at 5? Because that is what the quarterly record mentioned. I'm also thinking, what does it take to judge such things? In order to really know the skill of a scholar, you tend to need to have the same skill set, need to be in that field in general, unfortunately. And that's the way I can't judge the work of engineers the way engineers can. I can know if I can drive across the bridge, that's something, but my knowledge limits me from making that judgment. But from my judgment, working in this field, and we all work in this field, we do have many brilliant men and women today. Many. Their books are filling the shelves around us.
Bart Ehrman is like, look, guys, I'm like at the top of the academy here, and we don't really know the languages like the King James translators do. But people will tell people in their books that they know these languages fluently.
We are not ignorant of these things. It's not as if this couldn't be done. Okay, now.
Well, let me push back into the question. That you answered the question on the first side by talking about the godly capability of the scholars. Let me also push back against the idea that pre-KJV textual criticism was done by people who believed a different view of preservation. They're really taking their textually absolutist views and reading it back into those people. If you actually read what Erasmus, Stephanus, or Beza said, or the KJV translators about the text, none of them held that view. Erasmus was adamant that he didn't think any text could be perfect, that the work of clearing mistakes from manuscripts was a work the Holy Spirit approves of, and that it was a work that would never be done. He just didn't hold that kind of perfectionist view of preservation.
So not only...
Okay, so I'll just quickly go back to the translators to the reader. I should have kept that open. Okay. Okay, so I'll just get this in the mix. Okay. I let thy scriptures be my pure delight. Let me not be deceived by them, neither let me be deceived. Let me deceive by them. In this confidence and with this devotion did they assemble together, not too many, lest one should trouble another, and yet many, lest many things haply might escape them. If you ask what they had before them, it was truly the Hebrew text of the Old Testament and the Greek of the New. These are the two golden pipes, or rather conduits, wherethrough the olive branches empty themselves into the gold. Saint Augustine calleth them precedent of original tongues. Saint Jerome fountains. The same Saint Jerome affirmeth, and Gratian hath not spared to put it into his decree that the credit of the old books, he meaneth the Old Testament, is to be tried by the Hebrew volumes, and so the new by the Greek tongue. And so these guys they used the Greek and Hebrew, and they believed what they had before them was, the Hebrew and of the Old Testament and the Greek of the New. They believed that they had the Word of God before them. Okay, so I know there's other places I could go to in the preface, but I just can't think of it just at the moment. But actually, okay, so we never thought from the beginning that we should need to make a new translation, nor to make of a bad one a good one, for then, etc., but to make of a good one better, or of many good ones, one principal good one, not to be justly accepted against, that hath been our endeavour, that has been our mark. So they're saying they are making one principal good one. And in the other preface to King James, it clearly says that they went to the original languages, they went to all the English editions, and they went to all the foreign language translations. So they're making one principal good one out of all that. So they're finalizing the TR, they're finalizing all the English, and this is, a final edition that would be superior to language editions as well. And so, and like I mentioned in my other video, this hadn't been done before. They had done the starter editions with Tyndale, and they've gone through, Geneva and Bishops, and there's some errors in that we can easily point out, like Jacob in Matthew chapter 1. He's this extra guy in the genealogy, and so none of us would agree that should be in there. And so they wanted things like that out of the text. They wanted a pure Bible. They wanted one principal good one, and so when Miles Smith was writing this preface, he had never seen perfection like this before. When you do all these cross checks and balances, you get perfection. When you run through the work that had been done in the Reformation, which was like so good, like Beza's like 99.999% good, then they've run it through the sifter, and they've got tiny little things out, and it's perfect. They've done a perfect job. So that had not been seen before, and it's because of a new technology called printing had come on the scene. They'd been working towards this perfect text, and they were able to nail it in 1611. And so that is part of what Jesus prophesied would happen with the providence of God. And so did he actually say that it could never be done? Seems like a stretch. So I'm not sure who that's replying to. Or was that D.A. Waite? Maybe me, or like could never be done. Or was that something Mark Ward said? I'm not really sure. So I'll just try and keep going through this.
Does King James onlyism slander good people?
Not only does King James onlyism, you guys are slandering good people. He's Bart Ehrman, main guy in the academy, to say, look, we don't really know like the King James translators. And we would just agree with that. We would go, look, we've done our own Hebrew and Greek studies. We mightn't be the most flashiest scholars in the world, but we can point out when the king has no clothes. We can point out when silly errors have made it into the text. And even Mark Ward would agree with me against someone like James White and against a lot of the academy back 20 years ago that Easter is not a pagan thing. He's written articles on that now. And so I used to be at loggerheads with everyone in the academy about that. Now it's like, oh, actually, he's made a good point. Let's just run with it. And even atheists are making that point now. But we're part of King James only. We're slandering. No, we've just been pointing out that they get this wrong, this wrong, this wrong. How many things, can you get wrong until we just start saying you guys are incompetent? How many things does Jan Krantz have to get wrong in his book? Beyond what he's written, before people just say, well, he's a bad scholar.
And call them unbelievers for doing the work of textual criticism. It unfairly enlists on its side people who actually took the textual confidence view and not the textual absolutist view.
And I would say, you can look at you could look at any Bible translation committee and you could say, well, that person who is part of that committee had views that I disagree with.
Sure.
But if you're going to apply that standard, then you have no Bible at all. Erasmus was a runaway monk, didn't he?
A runaway monk? I think he's thinking of Luther there.
Dedicate his first edition to the Pope?
He also got a letter of commendation from the Pope, which he printed from his second edition on at the front of it, just to say, look.
Elijah Hixson loves this, because all throughout his article on 1 John 5:7, he goes through and tries to make out that the whole thing is from Roman Catholicism. It's got Catholic provenance. Someone wrote in the margin, this is dedicated to Mary or whatever, and it's like, it's a Catholic text, and so, I mean, the whole world was Catholic, in a sense of they were under this umbrella of the Roman Catholic Church in that period, and you couldn't just step out of that and just publish a whole bunch of stuff. Look at what happened with Luther. He did that, and all hell broke loose. And so if you were in the wrong part of society, if you were doing that in Italy, they would just knock on your door, they would burn you, your family, and all your books, and you would just be erased from history. And so yeah.
Look, even the Pope approves of my Bible.
So if we're going to say that because someone has connections to, say, Roman Catholicism,
these guys were trying to reform the church. It's got to be understood. Luther wanted to stay within the church and reform it. He got booted. Erasmus didn't. But then later on, all of Erasmus's books were put on the forbidden list. So that's where these guys have sort of like this lame understanding of the Roman Catholic Church at the time. And even like when you look at, say, the Ethiopic translation, the Syriac translation, these were actually done by Roman Catholics of the time. And so they were trying to unify a lot of these churches and bring them into the fold. And so they're like, okay, well, you need a Bible in Ethiopic. Cool, we'll work on it. And they were funding it, and they were inviting translators from Ethiopia. And they did the same with the Syriac. And so I know this from looking into the life of Tremellius, because he did this the next Syriac edition. And so but they were funded by the Roman Catholic Church. And so even in the Nestle-Aland text, the Ethiopic is called ETH.RO for Ethiopic, and from Rome. It was translated in Rome in 1549. And so the Roman Catholics did the Ethiopic Bible. It was sanctioned by the Pope. And it's like, that is like the word of God for the Ethiopic people. And when you look at it, it's not that detached from a TR edition. It's quite good. It's even got the reading of Revelation 16:5, shall be Somenos. That's what I pointed out to James White. So I'm not saying it's perfect or anything like that, but I'm just saying that they have this great, they have this concept of the Roman Catholic Church is just like this, is like Jesuits. And I mean, William Tyndale was a Roman Catholic until the day he died. He was a Roman Catholic priest. And then they choked him and burned him to death. But before they choked him, they defrocked him. They said, you're no longer a part of our church. So that way he would be damned forever. And so, you don't go around calling Tyndale just a Roman Catholic, And so they have this simplistic type of thing. It's just very black and white. You're in the church or you're out of the church. Why didn't you go and join the Lutherans, sort of thing? And why don't you join the church down the road, And people were just, they were trying to reform the church. Like if Luther had never been booted from the church, just say he died, like got found and they killed him in around the time of Erasmus, he probably would be called a Roman Catholic, you know what I mean? Who never left the church.
Then any Bible that's tainted with that is no good.
So the King James is in the wrong stream. I did not know this.
And not just that, but even the Greek manuscripts that a lot of people
right, exactly,
are Byzantine Greek manuscripts, and a lot of those have colophons. We can see who wrote them, and it might be shocking to see that some scribe who copied a book of the Gospels that's closer to the King James than to the ESV was thanking the Mother of God for giving him the grace to complete this work of copying.
Yeah.
I mean, Byzantine and Latin texts, of course, these are influenced by Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodox, of course they're going to have, things in the margin that say these type of things. And he's like, these are closer to the King James than so, the ESV. What the Gnostic readings in Vaticanus and Sinaiticus? It's like, what would you rather have, a Catholic reading that's closer to the TR, or a Gnostic reading that's closer to the Jehovah's Witness type of, Unitarian Arian type of thing? It's just this is sort of like a gotcha moment, and he does this in his articles where he keeps bringing up Catholic provenance about the manuscripts.
If we take the view that no one can do good textual or translational work unless they agree with me, two things. Number one, we'll end up having no text that we can use. Number two, we're in a totally different line of people from the good and godly men that we look back at, whether that be Luther using a rat. See, I've always viewed, like, if you go back and look at manuscripts, having someone say, like, having someone who's Orthodox and who is unorthodox, I can look at both of them and learn. I can look at someone who is unorthodox and they're using the text, they're still quoting the Bible that they had in front of them. Or they might be twisting it or whatever, but it's like you can see these type of things happening. And so that's important to know these things also. And so it's not just, okay, well, the guy who did this manuscript was of this particular, he was a Catholic or he was a Gnostic or whatever. Sometimes that has huge influence on the text, like Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. But at the end of the day, I can look at a Byzantine text, and if I've got in the back of my mind, these guys were very infatuated with Mary and chanted to Mary, and they had all sorts of weird religious concepts, they can help me to understand why there's certain verses that try to make Mary equivalent with Jesus, like with their purification in Luke 2:22, that there might be an overemphasis on Mary in some of the texts. And so when you're going through, you can understand those things. But the thing is, it's not like, oh, well, we can't use that text because it was written by a Catholic or it was written by this person or that person. We go through and we examine everything. Now, some texts like Vaticanus and Sinaiticus are just, there's texts that we all agree should be just rejected, like Codex Beza. Okay, we all sort of go, okay, that's like push that out of the room. And we believe Vaticanus and Sinaiticus are of that type of ilk. Now, then you come down to, okay, what's been brought through to us, and regardless of whether it's brought through the Latin or through the Greek, we can utilize all that and look at all that. And so, anyway. Erasmus text. Luther's convinced that Erasmus is on his way to hell, right? The bondage of the will, they debate back and forth. He says, pray for this Erasmus guy. He's going to burn in hell. But he had no problem using and translating his text. The King James translators, in their preface, bring up the idea that we should not judge men by their persons, but by their work. They were perfectly fine with quoting a heretic. And they raised the example of Augustine quoting Donatus. This idea, well, I can't use that text unless it came from someone who agrees with my beliefs. It just doesn't have good history behind it.
So if we're just to judge people by their work, which most people do, the Westcott and Hort text is a failure. The Westcott and Hort text is filled with mistakes. The Westcott and Nessel and all the other texts that are based upon it are flawed. So we're just judging what they've done, and we're going, it's rubbish. And so regardless, and so that would come against, just so they did have a whole bunch of people like a King James Translation Committee. It's the actual text that's the issue. And this is the thing that Mark Ward doesn't want to deal with. He doesn't want to deal with this issue of the text. It's the elephant in the room. And so that's why it's such a bizarre thing. He's only talking about readability.
So I would argue that also when we think about the KJV translators as textual critics, there's one or two other places that we should look beyond just the work of what they did.
Yeah, like where do they actually talk about their work of textual criticism?
Yeah,
do they?
They do. They're in individual sermons. They often raise text critical issues, so we can see them doing that. In the notes that we have today of their draft work on the King James Bible, we can see them discussing variants, sometimes disagreeing about variants, and I'll share an example of those at the end here when we get to it in a moment. But we also can see them talking about textual variants in their marginal notes. And if you're familiar with the King James Bible, you realize that it has marginal notes that are listed under three different types of symbols.
And so I'm going to stop it there because I did do, I think it was about 6 videos on the marginal notes by Timothy Berg. And so And what I might do is sort of just search for those. But if I'm doing that right now and searching for the notes and things like that, it'll take quite a while. And I've already been going for 3 hours and 18 minutes. So I'm going to pull the pin, and I'll probably try and do this later on, either tonight, but it will probably most likely be Australian time, maybe Monday night or something like that, where I'll jump on and complete this. So this is probably going to be a 3-parter. Hopefully it doesn't become a 4-parter. And so anyway, thanks for joining us, guys, and sorry about my tiredness and you know, look, like I was saying, I look like I just got out of prison, but I'm just pretty exhausted from the weekend. It's been pretty big, and I've done a whole bunch of stuff online. So yeah, share this around. You might know people who are interested in this sort of stuff. God bless you, and thanks for joining.